the fall of great Chinese dynasties, has often been described as if it followed a predictable human pattern. A dynasty was imagined as young and energetic at the beginning, stable and confident in its middle years, and then weakened by luxury, corruption, and decay as it approached its end. For a long time, this idea encouraged people to search for the origins of collapse far back in the past, as though failure had already been set in motion generations earlier. Yet that way of looking at history can be misleading. Long-term changes certainly mattered, but they did not make the collapse of the Ming or the Qing unavoidable. Conditions could shift dramatically within a few decades, and in both cases, the final destruction of a ruling house was shaped most directly by developments much closer to the moment of collapse. Instead of treating the end of a dynasty as the final stage of a fixed cycle, it is more revealing to look at the pressures, choices, and wars that gathered force in its final era. The end of the Ming has been explained in many ways. Some have blamed weak emperors, poisonous court politics, selfish eunuchs, rigid officials, or the wider instability of the 17th century. There is truth in several of these arguments, but the dynasty was not destroyed by moral decline alone. Its collapse unfolded over years of fighting, retreat, and military failure. In military terms, two large changes reshaped the fate of the Ming. The first came after the disaster at Tumu in the mid-15th century. From that point onward, the dynasty steadily lost its ability to act boldly along the northern frontier and increasingly chose defensive measures instead of active engagement with the steppe world. The second and far more immediate turning point came after the Liaodong campaign in the early 17th century. That defeat shattered Ming confidence at a critical moment and handed momentum to a rising enemy in the northeast. The earlier shift mattered, but it did not doom the dynasty by itself. The later one placed the Ming in a struggle it could no longer control. Weapons and military technology played an important role in the wars between the Ming, the Mongols, and later the Manchus. But superior tools alone did not decide the outcome. The Ming suffered badly when firearms, artillerymen, and technical knowledge passed into Manchu hands after defeat in Liaodong. For a brief moment, the dynasty recovered an edge by adopting improved cannon introduced through overseas contacts. Yet, that advantage did not last. Once both sides possessed comparable artillery and firearms, victory depended more on command, discipline, organization, and political will than on equipment alone. The contest that ended the Ming dynasty was therefore not a simple story of one side having better weapons. It was a long struggle in which leadership and institutional strength mattered at least as much as firepower. The people who founded the Qing were shaped by war at every level of society. Under a line of highly capable rulers, scattered Yurshen groups in the northeast were transformed into a disciplined military state. These communities did not begin with all the tools needed to conquer China. Their cavalry traditions gave them speed, endurance, and battlefield mobility, but they lacked expertise in siege warfare, artillery, and the administrative methods required to control fortified cities and large populations. To overthrow the Ming, they first had to learn from the very empire they intended to replace. They absorbed military techniques, adopted administrative practices, and built a new state strong enough to fight a prolonged war. Even then, Qing military power did not reach its full form immediately after victory. It matured over time, especially under the early emperors who turned conquest into durable imperial rule. When the Ming emperor returned to Beijing after his captivity following the catastrophe at Tumu, the dynasty had survived the crisis, but its prestige had been deeply wounded. The battle marked a decisive change in the Ming relationship with the peoples of the northern frontier. The court recovered from the shock politically, yet the military damage was much harder to repair. An enormous field army had been destroyed. and the dynasty never fully restored its earlier confidence. In the years that followed, the Ming gradually abandoned the attempt to dominate the open frontier in the old way. Defensive walls, fortified lines, and guarded positions increasingly became the answer to steppe pressure. Over time, this vast system of walls expanded until it stood as one of the most famous monuments in Chinese history. It was not simply a symbol of strength. It also reflected uncertainty, caution, and the growing reluctance of the Ming state to take the offensive. The firearms were added to this defensive system and proved highly effective in protecting cities and strongpoints. They gave garrisons the ability to resist cavalry raids and made urban centres much harder for steppe armies to storm. Yet the Mongols did not respond by building heavy siege forces of their own. Their strength remained mobility, fast cavalry, swift raids, rapid withdrawal, and the ability to gather suddenly in force all depended on avoiding the heavy burden of large supply trains and cumbersome artillery. Just as important, the Mongol leaders who threatened the Ming during these centuries were not always seeking to conquer China outright. In many cases, what they wanted was access to goods, supplies, and prestige. Steppe politics required resources from settled societies. Leaders needed food, metal, cloth, and luxury items to reward allies and maintain loyalty. If those things could be obtained through trade, gift exchange, or recognized relations with China, that was enough. But the Ming court increasingly refused such arrangements. Fear of appearing weak, combined with hostility toward outsiders, pushed the court toward hard-line policies. When trade was restricted, raiding became the alternative. Raiding then deepened Chinese suspicion, and the cycle hardened on both sides. The capture of the emperor exposed more than a single battlefield disaster. It forced the Ming court to face the larger decline of its military system. Army numbers had fallen, and many of the troops that remained were no longer of the same quality as earlier generations. Units stationed near the northern frontier were generally more capable than forces elsewhere, because that border faced a constant threat. The danger from the steppe never truly disappeared during the Ming period. In the 16th century, Mongol forces under Altan came as far as the outskirts of Beijing itself. Yet the northern frontier was not the dynasty's only military concern. The southern coast was troubled by maritime raiders, and the interior of the empire also demanded attention. The Ming had to respond to threats in many directions at once, and even when it won campaigns, those victories often came at a high cost. After the humiliation of Tumu, Ming's strategy became increasingly cautious. Large offensive expeditions against steppe enemies were dangerous, expensive, and usually produced only temporary results. Fortifying borders and abandoning exposed positions seemed more practical and sustainable. Yet this defensive policy was not born from weakness alone. At times, it followed successful military action. In one notable case, a Ming commander struck a Mongol encampment, killed many people, destroyed tents, seized herds, and then ambushed the returning raiders. With pressure briefly reduced, the state used the opportunity not for deeper pursuit, but to strengthen its fortifications. This choice revealed the logic of the age. Even after success, the court preferred building barriers to maintaining aggressive frontier warfare. As walls and artillery grew more important, firearms came to be used mainly in static defense rather than in open field attack. Chinese armies often adopted formations built around protection, discipline, and controlled fire. Their battlefield methods reflected the broader strategic thinking of the court. Because the steppe enemy presented few fixed targets and rarely depended on fortified positions, Ming cannon had limited offensive use. most commanders did not adapt by adopting steppe-style mobility or cavalry tactics. A few exceptions existed, but the larger pattern was clear. The dynasty that had once been capable of projecting power outward increasingly yielded the initiative to its enemies. The long conflict with Altan showed how rigid policy could turn border tension into prolonged warfare. Drought struck both North China and Mongolia, and Altan sought to reopen trade in order to secure food and supplies. The Ming rejected his requests. In one case, his messenger was even put to death. Raids followed, not only as retaliation, but as a practical way of obtaining what diplomacy had failed to provide. These attacks exposed the weakness of the frontier forces, and each clash ended badly for the Ming. The raids did not stop because the conditions that caused them had not changed. At court, some still believed firmness would restore control, yet inflexibility only drove the frontier deeper into crisis. A more aggressive proposal briefly emerged when a Ming official recommended both strengthening fortifications and striking the Mongols during the spring, when their horses were weakest after winter. The idea appealed to the emperor for a time, and some early results seemed promising. But many officials, especially those closer to the affected regions, wanted no part in a costly offensive experiment. Court politics shifted, support faded, and the effort was abandoned. Altan's pressure continued. Raids intensified, and he eventually threatened to strike Beijing itself if trade did not resume. The court tried to reinforce the defences, but in the middle of the century, Mongol forces broke through and reached the capital. The city did not fall. The garrison would not risk open battle, and the attackers could not breach the walls or sustain a prolonged siege. Instead, the surrounding districts were looted, and the raiders withdrew. The capital survived, but the shock was profound. The Mongol problem had not been solved. It had merely been held at bay, and only through walls, caution, and a strategy that offered no lasting answer. At the same time, the southern coast faced a different, but equally difficult challenge. Piracy and maritime trade were closely linked, and it was often impossible to draw a clean line between merchant activity and armed raiding. Restrictions on seaborne trade did not eliminate overseas commerce, they drove it underground. Chinese merchants, Japanese sailors, and foreign traders continued to exchange goods through unofficial channels. When the Ming court tried to suppress both trade and piracy through harsh measures, the result was the opposite of what it intended. Merchants who had once operated in a grey zone were pushed into more organised and more heavily armed networks. By the middle of the century, coastal raiding had become systematic. Pirate fleets established bases, attacked inland, seized garrisons, and threatened local administration. It took years of military effort to crush the largest groups, and only after a change of reign did policy finally ease enough for legal trade to resume. In this case, military success and political flexibility worked together, but only after years of unnecessary damage. The reigns that followed brought new dangers. One emperor presided over a relatively brief and calm period, but his successor inherited a realm that was more unstable than it appeared. The Mongol frontier was quieter in some areas, yet smaller raids continued. Far more serious was the rise of a new power in the northeast and the growing number of internal rebellions across China. During this reign, several important campaigns were fought. One targeted a powerful local ruler in the southwest, whose family had maintained semi-independent authority for centuries. That struggle dragged on for years, shifting between armed resistance and temporary submission, before the imperial army finally crushed it with overwhelming force. Another involved a revolt in the Ordos region, where Chinese and Mongolian forces mutinied in a strategically vital area. The court moved quickly to suppress it, eventually flooding the city that had become the center of resistance. These were significant campaigns, but the most famous military challenge of the age lay outside China itself. The war in Korea became the last major series of Ming operations that did not end in complete strategic disaster. A massive Japanese invasion swept rapidly across the peninsula, capturing major cities and driving north with alarming speed. The Ming intervened with expeditionary armies, including trained firearm units, and managed to recover important ground. The fighting was fierce, and although an early Chinese victory pushed the invaders back from the north, later clashes showed how difficult the campaign would be. Negotiations dragged on while Japanese forces retained a foothold in the south. Korean naval resistance, especially the disruption of maritime supply lines, played a decisive role in weakening the invasion. The war resumed after diplomacy collapsed, but by then the Chinese and Koreans were better prepared. The Japanese advance stalled, and the struggle ended only when leadership changed in Japan, and the invading armies were recalled. The war was costly and exhausting, and it unfolded at the same time that a new threat was taking shape on the Ming frontier. That threat was Nurhaci. While the Ming were absorbed by foreign war and internal disorder, he was uniting the Jurchen groups of the northeast and laying the foundations of a new political order. He accepted Ming titles when it suited him, but those formal ties concealed the steady growth of his power. He extended his influence over neighbouring peoples and showed an ability that earlier steppe challengers had often lacked. He was not merely seeking leadership over a loose tribal alliance. He was building a state. New institutions took shape under his rule, including a writing system suited to his people, and, most importantly, the banner organization that would define the military and administrative structure of the rising Manchu world. Households were assigned to banners, which served both as governing units and as military formations. This system gave Nurhaci cohesion, discipline, and an enduring framework for expansion. When he finally moved openly against the Mings, the challenge was deliberate and carefully prepared. He attacked a frontier town and then declared grievances in terms that practically guaranteed war. The Ming court responded exactly as he hoped, launching a large invasion into his territory. On paper, the imperial force was formidable. In practice, its design was deeply flawed. Divided into several separate columns, it advanced toward Nurhaci's center without proper mutual support. His capital was treated as the main objective, but he understood that a mobile army mattered more than a fixed location. He abandoned what could be abandoned and focused instead on destroying the invading forces one at a time. With fast-moving cavalry, he achieved local superiority even though his total numbers were smaller. Column after column was isolated and broken. Ming firearms were too slow and too poorly supported to reverse the outcome. Tactical criticism of the invasion plan was justified, but its greatest weakness lay at the strategic level. The Ming aimed at the wrong target and misunderstood the kind of enemy they faced. The defeat in Liaodong was devastating. Nurhaci had not merely survived a major imperial offensive, he had used it to elevate his own status and expose the weakness of the Ming. Fear spread in Beijing, and the court braced for further attacks. Yet Nurhaci did not rush recklessly forward. He understood that conquering the entire Ming realm was still beyond his reach. Instead, he focused on securing Liaodong step by step. Cities fell in succession, and as the region passed into his hands, he gained something even more valuable than territory. Ming soldiers surrendered along with their weapons, artillery knowledge, and practical experience in siege warfare. This was one of the great turning points in the balance of power. The Manchus had been formidable cavalrymen already. Now they were learning how to reduce fortified positions and use the military tools of a sedentary empire. The conquest of China did not happen through one battle or a single dramatic collapse. It was a long, uneven process involving many campaigns, fought across enormous distances and under widely different conditions. Still, some developments clearly accelerated the fall of the Ming and the rise of the Qing. By the early 1620s, the Manchu state had closed much of the technological gap. Later, the Ming briefly restored an advantage through improved cannon introduced from abroad. But this edge was temporary. Before long, the same kind of artillery was being manufactured for the Manchus with the help of Chinese specialists trained in those methods. One major siege in the early 1630s showed how much the balance had changed. There, both sides fought with cannon and firearms on a scale that revealed how far the Manchu war machine had evolved. Nurhaci's successor, Hung Taiji, inherited a state that was growing stronger but still faced a fundamental question. Was it meant merely to dominate the frontier and extract wealth, or was it destined to conquer and rule China itself? He did not begin with absolute certainty. To defeat Ming armies was one thing. To govern a vast agrarian empire was something else entirely. Among the Manchu elite, many saw war mainly as a way to win plunder, territory, and prestige. They were not all eager to transform their world into a Chinese-style empire. Yet Chinese advisors around Hung Taiji pressed in the opposite direction. If he succeeded in taking China, they would not be remembered as servants of outsiders, but as the wise early supporters of a legitimate new ruling house. Their ambitions and his own imperial aspirations slowly converged. To rule the Manchus fully, he increasingly had to imagine ruling China as well. The tension inside the Manchu leadership could be seen during a major incursion into Ming territory near Beijing. Several cities surrendered and were treated with restraint while Hung Taiji remained in command. But when another leader later chose to abandon the captured positions, he first looted them and massacred the population. The political consequences inside the Manchu world were serious, and Hung Taiji used the incident to weaken a rival. Yet the larger damage was long-lasting. Every later Ming commander considering surrender had reason to wonder whether submission would lead to safety or slaughter. In wars of conquest, reputation mattered as much as force, and fear could harden resistance even when military logic suggested capitulation. Another crucial result of these campaigns was the capture of Chinese artillery experts capable of casting the new style of cannon that had once given the Ming an edge. With them, Hung Taiji created specialized forces focused on artillery and siege work. He then turned this new capacity against heavily defended positions that guarded access through the frontier zone. One of the most famous of these operations became a prolonged siege in which the Manchus surrounded a fortified city, contained sorties, bombarded defenses, defeated multiple relief forces, and steadily tightened the noose. At one point, a much larger Ming army advanced in a strong formation supported by cannon and muskets. The battle that followed was fierce and costly, with frontal charges, artillery fire, confusion, regrouping, and a final collapse under combined pressure. Meanwhile, the besieged city fell into starvation and despair. Outlying forts surrendered, supply stocks shifted to the attackers, and the defenders were reduced to unspeakable extremes. In the end, the city capitulated after weeks of suffering. The siege demonstrated that the Manchu state had become something new. It was no longer only a cavalry power of the frontier. It could now conduct major siege operations, absorb surrendered officers, and integrate Chinese military expertise into its own expanding structure. As more Chinese troops entered Qing service, the nature of the Manchu war machine changed again. These troops could not simply disperse after a campaign and return to banner lands as traditional mounted followers might. They formed a standing army that demanded regular funding, administration, supplies, and a more complex state. At the same time, the court itself became more deeply shaped by Chinese institutions. Even as the leadership renamed its people and empire and formalized its imperial claims, there was also concern that adopting Chinese methods too fully might erode older frontier values. Yet the transformation could not be avoided. To defeat the Ming, the Qing needed Chinese siege knowledge, artillery, and administrative techniques. What had once been useful became essential. As Qing forces continued to pressure the northern defences, rebellion spread inside China. The Ming court now faced a nearly impossible dilemma. Troops were needed against rebels in the interior, but they were also required on the frontier against the Qing. Every attempt to solve one problem weakened the response to the other. Taxes rose to support new campaigns, and the burden on the population deepened resentment. Able generals could still defeat rebel forces or check Qing advances in particular places, but the state lacked the freedom and unity to do both at once. Qing leaders exploited this weakness skillfully, offering favourable surrender terms to Ming officers and making defection more attractive with each shift in the military balance. Court factionalism in Beijing only made matters worse. Decisions were delayed, confidence collapsed, and the dynasty's authority drained away. By the time the crisis of 1644 arrived, the Ming defences had been badly shaken but not entirely broken by the Qing. Then, a rebel leader from the northwest marched on Beijing. The court hesitated over whether to call frontier forces back to defend the capital. Proposals were debated, delayed, and entangled in political struggle. When the order finally went out, it came too late. Rebel armies entered the capital, and the emperor took his own life. One of the most powerful Ming generals on the frontier then faced a stark choice between the rebels who had taken Beijing and the Manchus beyond the passes. He chose the latter. That decision opened the way for the Qing advance. Under the regency that now guided the child emperor, Qing forces moved through the pass, drove out the rebels, buried the fallen Ming ruler with ceremony, and claimed the political center of China. Even then, the story was not over. The Ming regime did not vanish in a single day. Loyalist courts arose in the south, often divided among themselves and unable to agree on how to confront the two enemies now before them. Some still hoped that the Manchus might defeat the rebels and then settle for peace. That hope was misplaced. The Qing pursued both rivals relentlessly. The last important remnants of Ming resistance survived for years, but they never regained enough unity or strength to recover the empire. The conquest had been helped not only by Qing leadership and military adaptation, but also by the willingness of former Ming generals to change sides. These defectors were rewarded with enormous regional power, especially in the south and southwest, where they helped secure Qing rule. That arrangement later produced a new danger. Several of the powerful commanders who had aided the Qing became semi-independent princes in the territories they governed. One eventually rebelled, and others followed. At first, the uprising seemed capable of overturning Qing rule. The rebels won victories, and many believed the Manchus might be pushed back toward the north, but by then the Qing state was far stronger than its enemies realized. It controlled the greater resources of China and could draw on both manpower and agricultural wealth. The court restored its armies, improved artillery production, and fed its forces more effectively than the rebels could sustain their own war effort. Over time, the rebellion was crushed, and the dynasty emerged more secure than before. Instead of breaking Qing power, the crisis helped consolidate it. The reign that followed became one of the great military eras of early Qing history. After suppressing internal rebellion, the dynasty moved against maritime loyalists, who still held islands and coastal strongholds. Those remnants were eliminated, bringing an end to organized resistance in one of its last major refuges. The Qing also confronted Russian expansion in the north, leading to conflict, negotiation, and a treaty that stabilized the frontier. With the northern situation contained, the emperor turned westward against a powerful inner Asian rival. He personally campaigned across difficult terrain, pursuing an enemy whose strength lay in mobility and the open spaces of the steppe. Years of pressure wore that rival down until he was abandoned and destroyed. These campaigns proved something vital. The Qing army was no longer only the force that had conquered China. It had become a mature imperial military system, capable of long-distance logistics, sustained campaigning, coordinated cavalry and infantry action, and the effective use of firearms across deserts, grasslands, and mountains. This maturity did not mean that all future campaigns would be easy or successful. After one emperor succeeded another, the dynasty continued to expand and to face war along multiple frontiers. Agreements were reached with Russia while major operations were launched in the west against the Zunghars. These campaigns were prolonged and difficult, and final victory took time. Under the next reign, the destruction of that western rival became part of a much broader expansion of imperial territory. Yet later, military efforts were more uneven. Campaigns in Southeast Asia ended badly, while other operations, including the defense of Tibet, proved more successful. Qing power remained formidable, but its performance was no longer uniformly brilliant. By the 18th century, another transformation had become impossible to ignore. The old martial culture of the Manchus was fading. Most had now lived in China for generations. Many had never seen the world from which their ancestors had come, and even their language was losing ground. The emperor of the age took this decline seriously. He wanted to preserve what he believed was the original spirit of the dynasty, while also showing interest in the latest artillery techniques arriving from Europe. But court politics complicated both goals. Some officials did not share his cultural concerns, and others were skeptical of outside knowledge or the foreign religious figures who often transmitted it. Military technology, cultural identity, and political rivalry became entangled. Foreign missionaries had long provided scientific and technical knowledge in hopes of winning influence. Yet, the Qing court accepted their expertise far more readily than their beliefs. What those outsiders could offer still had value, but the empire used them selectively and on its own terms. There was an irony in this exchange. Even as the court sought technical help, the knowledge available through these channels was no longer always the most current by global standards. Still, despite the limits of the information it received and the internal tensions of the court, the Qing state remained strong enough in this period to enlarge its empire to an unprecedented scale. The energy of its frontier tradition, the administrative strength it had absorbed from China, and the technical assistance it could still draw upon together sustained imperial expansion long after the fall of the Ming. In the end, the story of the Ming collapse and Qing rise is not a simple morality tale about a decadent dynasty being replaced by a vigorous one. It is a story of shifting military systems, frontier politics, difficult choices, and long wars. The Ming did not fall because history had decreed its decline centuries in advance. It fell because, in its final generations, it lost the strategic initiative, suffered devastating defeats, failed to respond coherently to simultaneous threats, and faced an enemy that learned from it even while preparing to destroy it. The Qing succeeded because it combined steppe military strength with Chinese administrative practice, adapted faster than its opponent, and turned conquest into durable power. That transformation, not the old language of inevitable dynastic cycles, explains why one empire failed and another rose in its place. For many years, historians have debated the idea that early modern warfare underwent a dramatic transformation. One influential interpretation argued that a major shift occurred in Europe after the late 16th century. According to this view, armies built around relatively small groups of cavalry gradually gave way to large formations of disciplined infantry armed with gunpowder weapons. These new forces were drilled, organized, and supported by increasingly complex state structures. The change was not only about weapons. It also involved new military formations, professional training, and the rise of armies that operated as permanent institutions, rather than temporary warbands. Another argument emphasized the transformation of military architecture during the same period. As artillery improved, traditional medieval walls proved increasingly vulnerable. In response, engineers developed new systems of fortification with angled bastions and thick defensive layers designed to resist cannon fire. These innovations reshaped warfare across Europe and demanded enormous resources from governments that wanted to maintain effective defences. Together, these developments formed what many historians came to call a military revolution. The discussion did not remain limited to Europe. Some scholars tried to extend the debate to the wider world, asking whether similar changes occurred in Asia and other regions. In this interpretation, European success overseas was connected to military structures that other societies supposedly failed to adopt. According to that argument, many indigenous societies in the Americas, Africa, and Southeast Asia lost their independence partly because they were unable to absorb European military technology. In other parts of the world, including large Islamic empires, the argument suggested that new weapons were adopted but not fully integrated into existing military systems. As a result, European armies were believed to have gained a long-term advantage. Earlier historians had already explored the spread of gunpowder weapons outside Europe. In discussions of the great Islamic empires of the early modern period, the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals were often described as powerful states built around the effective use of firearms and artillery. These empires expanded rapidly during the 16th and 17th centuries, and many scholars believed that their success rested largely on their ability to employ gunpowder technology in organized infantry and artillery units. In this perspective, the arrival of gunpowder transformed older systems of warfare that had relied heavily on armoured cavalry and fortified strongholds. One well-known example often discussed in this context is the confrontation between the Mamluks and the Ottomans in the early 16th century. The Mamluk system had long depended on elite cavalry warriors, trained for mounted combat. The Ottomans, however, fielded disciplined infantry equipped with firearms as well as powerful artillery units. Their military organisation combined gunpowder weapons with centralised command structures, allowing them to achieve rapid expansion. To many historians, this conflict seemed to confirm the broader idea that gunpowder and disciplined infantry had become decisive instruments of power. Yet a closer look reveals a complicated picture. The same scholars who described the Muslim empires as slow to adapt military change also acknowledged that these states achieved remarkable expansion across Asia. This produced an obvious contradiction. If these empires had truly failed to adapt to gunpowder warfare, how did they conquer such vast territories and maintain powerful states for centuries? Some observers suggested that their weapons were effective against regional rivals, but inferior when compared with European forces. However, this explanation rarely appeared clearly in historical writing. Another area of debate concerned the financial pressures created by new military technologies. The maintenance of gunpowder armies required large and steady flows of revenue. In Europe, this need was often associated with the rise of stronger centralized governments that were able to collect taxes and organize resources on an unprecedented scale. In other parts of the world, the results were more complex. In the Ottoman Empire, for example, the expansion of firearms and the growing costs of warfare did not always strengthen central authority. Instead, local elites sometimes gained greater influence because they controlled the manpower and resources needed for military service. The spread of firearms could therefore strengthen both central power and regional autonomy at the same time. A similar pattern appeared in parts of South Asia. Powerful states emerged during the late medieval and early modern periods, yet strong regional chiefs continued to operate alongside them. The relationship between warfare, finance, and political authority remained fluid. Military developments could contribute to state formation, but they could also encourage fragmentation when local leaders gained access to weapons, manpower, and financial resources. Understanding these dynamics requires attention to the unique geography and political traditions of the Indian subcontinent. Pre-modern warfare in India did not revolve around rigid territorial states, with clearly defined borders. Instead, political authority was often shaped by shifting zones of influence. Many kingdoms possessed broad core regions of settled agriculture surrounded by transitional landscapes of forest, scrubland, and semi-arid territory. These outer areas were inhabited by pastoral groups, traders, and mobile warrior bands who moved between the settled and frontier worlds. These transitional regions functioned as internal frontiers. They provided access to resources that were essential for power, including cattle, wealth, and military recruits. A successful ruler needed influence in both the agricultural heartland and the frontier zones that supplied manpower and mobility. For this reason, warfare often unfolded along these internal borders. Rulers seeking expansion rarely remained stationary. Instead, they conducted frequent campaigns that moved across wide regions of the subcontinent. Seasonal conditions shaped these campaigns. Military expeditions typically began after the monsoon rains had ended and the roads became passable. Rivers were easier to cross, and the availability of grazing and harvested crops helped sustain armies and their animals. By the time the intense heat of summer approached, most campaigns ended. Warriors often returned to their homes or urban quarters, while farmers resumed agricultural work. In many cases, warfare was integrated into the yearly rhythm of society. Imperial campaigns were rarely simple military operations. In the Mughal period, for example, a campaign could involve the movement of the entire imperial court. Thousands of attendants travelled with the army. Officials, craftsmen, merchants, entertainers, and members of the royal household accompanied the emperor as the court moved slowly across the landscape. These journeys resembled vast moving courts, rather than fast military expeditions. Progress was measured in only a few kilometers each day, with frequent pauses for ceremony and administration. This elaborate display served an important political purpose. The emperor appeared as both ruler and conqueror, surrounded by visible symbols of wealth and authority. Nobles presented tribute and gifts while receiving honors, titles, and rewards. Such spectacles reinforced loyalty and demonstrated imperial power. Although these grand processions might appear inefficient from a purely military standpoint, they were central to maintaining authority across a vast and diverse empire. Another defining feature of warfare in India was the fluid nature of alliances. Loyalty in war was often negotiable. Alliances could shift quickly, and warriors frequently changed sides, depending on opportunity and reward. Political strategy often involved negotiation, bribery, and persuasion as much as battlefield confrontation. Wealth and prestige played major roles in attracting allies. In this environment, rulers tried to create elite groups of warriors whose loyalty would remain stable. Early Muslim rulers sometimes relied on military slaves who were trained specifically for service to the state. Later, regimes attempted to strengthen loyalty through ethnic bonds, marriage alliances, or religious patronage. Even so, the constant shifting of alliances remained a permanent feature of political life. Despite this fluid political environment, military power still mattered enormously. Successful rulers demonstrated their strength through decisive victories, especially during the early stages of expansion. Once authority was established, however, violence was often replaced by negotiation and accommodation. Conquerors frequently incorporated former enemies into their own systems of power, offering rank, income, and status in exchange for loyalty. During the medieval centuries, a major transformation occurred in Indian warfare with the growing importance of the war horse. New dynasties emerged from regions where mounted warfare was particularly effective. In the north, cavalry forces connected to Central Asian traditions played a decisive role. In the south, new political powers rose from upland areas where horse-based warfare became increasingly prominent. Technological developments improved the effectiveness of cavalry. Changes in saddles, harnesses, and riding equipment gave mounted warriors greater stability and control. The spread of stirrups and horseshoes enhanced mobility and shock power on the battlefield. Together, these innovations increased the impact of cavalry charges and allowed riders to fight more effectively. Mounted archery also gained renewed importance in northern India. Cavalry archers could fire rapidly while remaining mobile, harassing enemies from a distance before closing for decisive attacks. The composite bow, constructed from several materials and capable of great power and range, was a key element of this style of warfare. In the hands of skilled riders, trained in Central Asian traditions, mounted archery could overwhelm opponents, who relied on simpler weapons. These developments required strong horses and specialized training. Nomadic societies of Central Asia possessed long traditions of horsemanship and breeding that gave them advantages in mounted warfare. At the same time, India itself contained regions well suited for raising horses and other animals used in transport. Camels and oxen played essential roles in moving supplies across large distances, allowing cavalry armies to operate more widely than before. Despite the growing dominance of the horse on the battlefield, another traditional animal remained an important symbol of power: the war elephant. Elephants could smash enemy lines and create panic among opposing troops. Yet they were difficult to control and sometimes caused chaos among their own side. As cavalry tactics improved, elephants became less decisive, although they continued to appear in armies as impressive displays of strength and prestige. During the centuries that followed, siege warfare became increasingly important. Advances in siege technology allowed attacking armies to threaten even strong fortifications. Gunpowder explosives began to appear in sieges, where they could be used to destroy walls or undermine defensive structures. Engineers dug tunnels beneath fortifications or launched explosive devices into defended positions. At the same time, powerful mechanical siege engines capable of throwing heavy projectiles were introduced. These machines could hurl large stones over considerable distances and posed serious threats to existing walls. Their use forced defenders to rethink the design of fortifications. Indian forts responded by evolving. Towers were strengthened to allow defensive fire against attackers. Walls were thickened and reinforced. Some fortifications incorporated internal chambers and storage areas to support prolonged defence. In many cases, forts were built on steep hills or surrounded by difficult terrain, making them harder to approach with siege equipment. By the early modern period, gunpowder weapons such as cannon and handheld firearms had spread widely across the subcontinent. Artillery was manufactured locally, and matchlock firearms became common among soldiers. Yet the actual impact of these weapons on warfare was often limited. Sieges remained slow and difficult operations. Moving heavy artillery across rough terrain posed enormous challenges. Defenders could also employ cannon from their walls, making artillery valuable for both sides. In many cases, forts were not captured through bombardment, but through negotiation or bribery. Wealth and political persuasion frequently succeeded where firepower alone failed. On the battlefield, artillery faced similar limitations. Heavy guns were difficult to maneuver and often inaccurate. Their firing could signal the start of battle, but cavalry usually dominated the decisive phase of combat. Many guns were constructed in ways that made them heavy and unreliable, and ammunition often lacked standardization. Infantry armed with firearms existed in large numbers, but their role in major battles remained secondary. Many foot soldiers were part-time fighters who combined military service with farming or other work. Their equipment and training varied widely, and they rarely operated in the disciplined formations that characterized European infantry of the same period. Mounted warriors therefore retained their central place in Indian warfare. Cavalry remained faster, more flexible, and often better protected than foot soldiers. Even when firearms were present, they did not replace traditional mounted tactics. Archery from horseback continued to compete effectively with early firearms, which were slow to reload and limited in accuracy. One famous early victory involving gunpowder weapons occurred during the rise of the Mughal Empire. Yet even in that case, success depended not only on artillery, but on traditional Central Asian tactics that combined cavalry maneuver with defensive barriers designed to slow enemy charges. Gunpowder had become part of warfare, but it did not overturn older patterns overnight. Centuries later, the same lesson remained visible. On the same battlefield where the Mughals once fought, heavily armed forces relying on artillery could still be defeated by highly mobile cavalry. The balance between mobility and firepower continued to shape warfare across the Indian subcontinent. The story of military change in India, therefore, does not fit neatly into the idea of a universal gunpowder revolution. Firearms and artillery certainly appeared and spread widely, yet older forms of warfare remained powerful and adaptable. Cavalry traditions, shifting alliances, and flexible political systems ensured that military transformation followed its own path in the subcontinent. The evolution of warfare was real, but it unfolded in ways shaped by geography, society, and long-established military cultures. A true transformation in Indian warfare did not fully arrive with the first appearance of cannon or handheld guns. That deeper change only became unmistakable in the later 18th century, when improvements in metal casting and barrel boring finally turned artillery into a far more dependable and destructive weapon. Better-made guns were more accurate, more durable, and easier to move than the older heavy pieces that had so often slowed armies down without deciding battles. In European hands, and increasingly in Indian armies, trained or advised by European specialists, artillery now became effective not just in long sieges, but also in open battle. For the first time, field guns could move with the army, keep pace with operations, and influence the outcome of combat in a sustained way. The old limitations of Indian artillery had not vanished overnight, but the balance had clearly begun to shift. Firepower was no longer merely ceremonial or supplementary. It was becoming central. infantry changed just as dramatically. The spread of the flintlock musket gave foot soldiers a weapon that was lighter, faster, more reliable, and easier to use than the older matchlock. It was less vulnerable to weather, quicker to fire, and more practical in the chaos of battle. Pre-prepared paper cartridges increased the rate of fire, while the socket bayonet allowed infantrymen to defend themselves against cavalry without needing separate ranks of pikemen. This mattered enormously. Older infantry systems had depended on complicated formations and specialized support weapons. But the flintlock simplified battlefield drill and made disciplined musket infantry much more flexible. Flintlocks had existed earlier, but it was in the 18th century that they became widely adopted and began to reshape warfare on a broad scale. India followed this development quickly. The result was not the sudden disappearance of cavalry, but a gradual transfer of military weight from the mounted warrior to the drilled infantry regiment. This was the age in which sepoy battalions rose to prominence. Indian armies had not traditionally specialized in tightly drilled infantry on the European model. Yet, the transition proved easier than might be expected. European officers were available for hire, and Indian rulers had no shortage of recruits. Once training methods were simplified and adapted, Indian foot soldiers could be organized into disciplined formations, capable of delivering repeated volleys and holding their ground under pressure. Between the mid-18th century and the early 19th, the military labour market itself began to change. Earlier generations had relied heavily on Turkish, Afghan, and other mounted mercenaries whose value lay above all in cavalry skill and access to horses. Now, a new figure entered the scene, the European military adventurer, bringing with him drill, artillery practice, and infantry discipline. This shift did not erase the older military world, but it introduced a new centre of gravity. Even so, integrating these new infantry formations into the larger structure of Indian armies was never entirely smooth. The prestige of the horse remained powerful. Political culture, aristocratic identity, and long habit all favoured cavalry. Many rulers and nobles still judged military splendour through the image of mounted retainers, swift raids, and noble horsemen circling the battlefield. Yet the logic of war was changing. Armies that successfully combined disciplined infantry with mobile artillery began to enjoy a major advantage over forces still organised around older assumptions. In this respect, the armies of the East India Company became especially important. They did not merely copy European methods in a distant setting. They applied them with unusual effectiveness in Indian conditions, building forces whose equipment and organisation kept pace with the best armies of the age. Their muskets matched the standards of contemporary European warfare, and their artillery could move and fire with a speed and consistency that many of their opponents struggled to answer. The spread of the flintlock also reshaped cavalry itself. Mounted troops did not simply disappear in the face of better infantry fire. Instead, many adapted. Indian horsemen increasingly adopted shorter firearms, often using them in a style already familiar from Turkish and Afghan practice. Riders could wheel around the enemy, fire rapidly, and wear down opponents through repeated attacks rather than relying only on the shock of the direct charge. Compared with the old matchlock, the flintlock made such tactics far easier to manage. It also required less specialist training than the composite bow, which had once been the great weapon of the mounted archer. In this way, firearms did not just strengthen infantry, they also encouraged changes within cavalry warfare itself. At the same time, the character of cavalry began to shift. Heavy cavalry, once the proud core of so many armies, gradually gave way to lighter mounted forces. Part of this change came from the improved effectiveness of infantry fire, which made dense, armoured charges more dangerous and less rewarding. But there was another side to it as well. Light cavalry revived older patterns of mobile warfare that had long existed on the edges of settled empires. Fast horsemen remained extremely useful for reconnaissance, raiding, pursuit, escort work, and the protection of supply lines across vast distances. In this sense, the age of infantry did not eliminate the horse. It redefined its role. Light cavalry became an essential complement rather than the unquestioned master of the battlefield. Beyond battle itself, horses still offered something infantry could not: speed in plunder and movement. Mounted warriors remained invaluable in the looser, less formal sides of war, especially raiding and the seizure of booty. This reality was noticed again and again in campaigns where infantry won the battle, but cavalry claimed the spoils. European foot soldiers often complained that by the time they reached the field after a victory, the valuable goods had already been seized and carried away by Indian horsemen who had waited for the right moment before sweeping in. Such scenes reveal how incomplete the military transition really was. Fire discipline and artillery power were changing the formal battlefield, but older instincts of mobility, opportunism, and mounted prestige remained deeply rooted. When a missionary in the Caribbean asked enslaved Africans how they had fallen into captivity, many gave the same answer: they had been taken in war. That detail matters enormously. Between the early 16th century and the mid-19th, millions of Africans were carried across the Atlantic. If so many of them were first seized on African battlefields, or in the aftermath of campaigns, then warfare in Atlantic Africa was not a side story to the making of the modern world. It was one of its central forces. These wars helped shape the largest oceanic migration the world had yet seen. Yet for a long time they were either treated as a background detail or reduced to crude explanations. Some imagined them as little more than slave raids fueled by European traders and firearms. Others dismissed them as irrational tribal violence, as if vast campaigns involving thousands of fighters, long marches, supply networks, shifting alliances and major political decisions could somehow emerge without planning or purpose. In reality, African wars were every bit as complex as wars elsewhere. They were rooted in power, geography, economy, and statecraft, and they deserved to be understood on those terms. There was no single African way of war. Atlantic Africa alone contained many millions of people living under more than 100 independent states, and political communities of very different size, structure, and ambition. The environments they occupied were equally varied. The Atlantic-facing regions stretched from dry northern and southern lands into dense tropical forests, broad savannas, lagoon systems, river deltas, and difficult coastal zones. These physical conditions mattered deeply because they shaped what kinds of armies could exist and how campaigns were fought. One major divide ran between areas where horses could survive and areas where disease or environment made cavalry impossible. North of the rainforest belt, across much of the western savannas, horses could be kept alive despite constant difficulty, and cavalry became a major arm of warfare. South of that zone, especially in the forests and much of Central Africa, cavalry either struggled or disappeared entirely. Open land alone was not enough. In Angola, for example, outsiders saw broad savannas and assumed mounted armies would flourish there, only to discover that disease destroyed horses and left cavalry largely useless, except as ceremonial display. A second major divide came later, with the spread of European firearms. Ships had carried guns to African waters from the beginning of sustained contact, but for a long time this did not fundamentally reshape African war on land. Only after the flintlock began to replace the older matchlock did firearms become practical enough to transform armies in some regions. This change did not happen everywhere at once, and it did not produce identical outcomes. Instead, the effects of guns intersected with older ecological realities, especially the presence or absence of cavalry. In some parts of West Africa, expensive horses gave military and social power to elites, who could maintain them. In forest kingdoms, the older bow remained important much longer. Later, firearms altered the balance again, sometimes allowing rulers to concentrate military force in new ways. Historians have long debated whether the slave trade created self-reinforcing cycles in which rulers bought horses or guns with slaves, then used those same horses or guns to capture more slaves. Such models can be useful, but they often flatten a reality that was far more varied. The actual conduct of African warfare shows leaders making strategic choices, responding to local dangers and adapting to changing conditions with far more calculation than these simple cycles suggest. The military map of Atlantic Africa can be understood through three broad zones. The first was the cavalry world of the southern Sahara and the western Sudan, where mounted warfare dominated, despite the difficulty of sustaining horses. The second was the infantry world of the forests and adjoining regions, where foot soldiers were the backbone of armies. The third was the waterbound world of the coast, lagoons, creeks and estuaries, where marine forces operating from canoes and shallow craft played a decisive role. These zones were not sealed off from one another. Along their edges, different military cultures met, clashed, and sometimes adapted to each other. In the region, later associated with Dahomey, cavalry could operate farther south than in many other places, bringing mounted and infantry traditions into unusually direct contact not far from the coast. These military landscapes also overlapped with political structures. In the savannas, large states often emerged, some of them true regional powers, commanding wide populations and extensive territory. Along the coast, by contrast, there were often many small political bodies, especially before the rise of stronger regional kingdoms. In Central Africa, large kingdoms such as Congo and Ndongo existed beside rugged zones, where smaller powers preserved their autonomy. Europeans entered this world not as creators of its military systems, but as new actors within them. They brought trade opportunities, demand for captives, and access to new weapons. But they did not step into an empty space. They encountered military cultures that were already highly developed. In the 16th century, the desert and savanna cavalry of West Africa were armed with lances, swords, javelins, and sometimes bows. Their horses were often small but agile, valued more for speed and maneuver than for massive shock. Cavalry usually fought by weakening the enemy first. Riders harassed opposing forces with javelins or arrows, only closing with blade or lance once the enemy line had begun to break. In the larger savanna, states' infantry outnumbered cavalry heavily, but cavalry still held great prestige and often delivered the decisive action. Major states could field thousands of riders in important campaigns, and the most powerful kingdoms deployed large mounted forces in battles that determined the balance of power across whole regions. In the western savannas and farther east in states like Oyo, cavalry doctrine followed similar principles. Mounted troops used missiles to disrupt and scatter, then struck home when disorder appeared. Horses were precious, and maintaining cavalry required wealth, skill, and access to supply. For that reason, mounted warfare was closely tied to elite power, yet cavalry was rarely alone. In places where infantry had to coexist with horsemen, foot soldiers developed methods specifically designed to survive cavalry attack. In parts of Senegambia, infantry relied heavily on bows, often using poisoned arrows that could incapacitate even when they did not kill outright. These infantry forces formed disciplined groupings with shield bearers, protecting the more vulnerable archers, and their survival depended on not breaking under cavalry pressure. South of the cavalry zone, where horses were far less important or impossible to maintain, warfare looked different. In regions such as Benin, Congo, and Ndongo, the dominant figure was the skilled infantryman. These soldiers often fought in looser formations than European observers expected, giving them space to maneuver, throw weapons, and engage in individual combat while still supporting one another. Battles often began with a missile phase. Arrows, javelins, or heavy clubs might be used to disrupt the enemy first. Then came close combat with swords, lances, axes, and shields. To outsiders used to tighter lines, these open formations could look disorderly, but they were well suited to the terrain and to the fighting traditions of the region. In Congo and Ndongo, armies often opened with archery before closing rapidly into hand-to-hand combat. Some fighters carried shields and a mixture of cutting and thrusting weapons. Others depended more on agility and personal skill than on heavy protection. These engagements could be brief and violent, ending when one side lost cohesion and fled. In the dense forest zones farther west, such as the Gold Coast, terrain forced armies into narrower spaces. There, the style of warfare became more compact. Heavily armed troops advanced in closer order. Archers and skirmishers supported them, and the battle often culminated in a short but intense melee. Some soldiers were tasked with finishing off the wounded or taking prisoners once the main clash had passed. Along the coast and in the waterways, another form of war developed. In both Upper and Lower Guinea, naval or amphibious warfare was essential. Canoes and shallow craft could carry significant numbers of armed men through estuaries, lagoons, rivers, and creeks that were inaccessible to larger vessels. These forces relied heavily on missiles, especially arrows and javelins, since combat on water or in marshy terrain often rewarded ranged attack over close fighting. In the Niger Delta and lagoon zones, naval power could determine political control as effectively as cavalry did in the savannah. The Kingdom of Benin built strong influence in part through this kind of dominance, projecting force over waterways and coastal settlements, where purely land-based armies were at a disadvantage. When Europeans first appeared along these coasts, they quickly learned that the sea did not automatically give them mastery ashore. The coast of West Africa offered few natural harbours, and rough surf, lagoons, offshore bars, and shallow waters made amphibious landings extremely difficult. Early encounters with African marine fighters made it clear that Europeans could not simply impose themselves through naval strength, artillery, or armour. That fact shaped the whole history of Atlantic Africa. Europeans became traders, guests, allies, and sometimes meddlers, but in most places they did not arrive as conquerors. Their forts, where they existed, stood because local rulers allowed them to stand. Over time, Europeans established fortified trading posts, especially where gold and later slaves entered Atlantic commerce. These forts could be substantial, with cannons, garrisons, and formal agreements with local rulers. Yet the existence of a fort did not mean control of the surrounding country. European companies might dominate the small town clustered around a fortress, and their troops might take part in local rivalries. But outside a few exceptional cases, they did not rule large territories. Their soldiers often acted as mercenaries, and European powers fought one another for commercial access as much as they dealt with African states. Their presence was significant, but it was embedded in African political realities, rather than standing above them. Angola was the clearest exception, though even there, conquest was not simply the result of European military superiority. Portuguese expansion in Central Africa depended heavily on alliances, river access, naval advantage, and African troops. Portugal first entered local politics as an ally and supplier of military assistance. When those alliances shifted, survival depended on playing one African power against another and building support among rival rulers. The armies that pushed Portuguese influence forward were often overwhelmingly African in composition, including allies and mercenary groups recruited from the region. Much of the actual fighting in 17th century Angola was carried out by these African forces, not by a small European corps imposing itself by sheer firepower. Even where Europeans did not conquer, they influenced warfare through trade. In some savanna regions, they supplied horses, sometimes larger mounts, than local breeders could easily provide. Historians have argued that this gave an advantage to rulers with access to the coast, though the total numbers involved may have been too small to transform the cavalry balance over the long term. Firearms mattered more. Yet even here, the change was gradual. In the 16th and 17th centuries, guns were present in parts of Africa, but they were often fitted into existing tactical systems, rather than overturning them. On the Gold Coast, for example, firearms might be used during the skirmishing phase of battle, much as bows had been used before. In Angola, musketeers could play a role similar to archers, while Portuguese fighters often proved most effective not because of their guns, but because of their skill as heavily armed infantry in close combat. Only with the widespread use of the flintlock did guns begin to transform warfare more fundamentally. Even then, the change was uneven. In cavalry regions such as Senegambia, mounted fighters adopted firearms without abandoning older tactical habits. Carbines and sabres entered cavalry warfare, and infantry guards or elite units added muskets. But the overall logic of battle remained familiar. Elsewhere, especially in infantry zones, the effect was far more dramatic. In the Gold Coast and the region of Benin, firearms gradually replaced bows and javelins as the main missile weapons. At the same time, the older style of battle centered on a final rush into hand-to-hand combat began to fade. Combat became more dispersed and more dependent on sustained fire. Observers in the 18th century described battle lines on the Gold Coast, remaining close to one another for long periods, exchanging musket fire rather than immediately closing to melee. The result was not a European-style battlefield, but it was unmistakably different from the earlier mode of war. In Dahomey, soldiers were increasingly armed with muskets, while swords remained as sidearms for close work. Firearms were now central enough that rulers could boast of having abandoned bows and arrows almost entirely. This mattered especially because Dahomey faced pressure from Oyo, a cavalry power from the north. Oyo's horsemen were not themselves transformed by gunpowder in any revolutionary way, but their ability to raid the south forced Dahomey to adapt. Dahomey responded by reorganizing for closer infantry fighting and by building field defenses that blunted cavalry attacks while maximizing the value of muskets. European advisors may have helped with some of these changes, especially in fortification, but the adaptation itself was driven by immediate local necessity. Even so, firearms did not guarantee victory over cavalry. Dahomey struggled for years against Oyo. Its infantry could defend strong positions and inflict damage, but it could not easily prevent the more mobile cavalry from ravaging the countryside. In the end, Dahomey survived, but had to accept a subordinate relationship, paying tribute and enduring oversight. The lesson was clear. Guns had altered war, but they had not erased the power of mobility. A similar pattern appeared when Asante tried to push northward from the forest into the savannah. Its armies, formidable in their own environment, discovered that muskets alone did not easily overcome cavalry in open country. Only by working with allied mounted forces could Asante eventually project power into those regions. Along the coast, firearms also changed marine warfare. Dahomey learned this when it conquered major coastal states but failed to subdue their lagoon and island refuges. Rulers who retreated into the waterways could still resist, using canoes, artillery, and musket-armed fighters to hold out against a land power that struggled to master the aquatic terrain. Coastal polities in the lagoons and islands remained stubbornly independent, and their control of movement by water prevented complete conquest from inland states. Here again, environment and local military traditions mattered just as much as access to new weapons. In Angola and Congo, muskets spread widely in the 18th century, especially in areas closely tied to coastal trade. Some armies came to rely heavily on them, including those fighting in major civil wars. Yet older weapons and older styles never disappeared entirely. Archers still appeared in some armies, and even in forces associated with the Portuguese frontier, there could be units divided between bowmen and musketeers. Farther inland, beyond the strongest Atlantic influence, some armies continued to value swords, shields, and close combat above all else. In parts of the Kwango Valley and among forces advancing from the east, missile weapons were sometimes disdained as unworthy compared with hand-to-hand fighting. Such attitudes remind us that military change was not simply a matter of receiving new tools. It depended on values, training, supply, and strategic priorities. War in Atlantic Africa was never purely about the slave trade, but the trade unmistakably shaped its consequences, and sometimes its conduct. In many regions, war remained a continuation of politics by violent means. Large states fought to defend borders, suppress rebellion, or assert supremacy. Smaller states fought for survival, succession, and advantage. Yet once captives could be sold into Atlantic commerce in large numbers, the treatment of the defeated changed. In some places, especially during the 18th century, victorious armies deliberately stripped conquered territories of people. Deportation became both a source of profit and a military strategy. By removing inhabitants, conquerors weakened future resistance while also gaining wealth to sustain further campaigns. Senegambia offers a striking example of how political fragmentation and the slave trade could interact. Earlier centuries had seen large empires capable of imposing significant order across wide areas. But when those great powers weakened or collapsed, smaller states, succession struggles, civil wars, and nomadic intervention created a far more unstable environment. Warfare became more frequent, more destructive, and more entangled with pillage. Raiding was not always separate from politics. It often emerged from dynastic disputes, shifting alliances, and weakened authority. Yet European traders were ready to support one faction or another whenever captives could be turned into commerce. At times, rulers, rebels, and nomadic raiders all entered this system, each pursuing political or military goals, while feeding captives into the slave trade. Religious and reform movements in the region recognized the connection between predatory rule, warfare, and enslavement. Leaders condemned both the raiding of rulers against their own populations and the sale of captives overseas. Such movements had their own political agendas and internal complexities, but they drew support from widespread anger over the human costs of this violent system. The Atlantic market had not created all conflict, but it intensified the incentives for certain kinds of war and made civilian populations more vulnerable to mass deportation. On the Gold Coast, the emergence of strong regional powers in the age of firearms produced another pattern. Large states rose through wars between rival coalitions, punctuated by major battles and followed by smaller campaigns, pressure on subject communities, and occasional civil wars. In this setting, the slave trade was not the sole engine of conflict, but it strongly shaped what victors did after success. Deporting conquered populations could bring wealth, replenish weapons through trade, and reduce the enemy's future military potential. Some rulers chose restraint when they hoped to absorb the defeated population and strengthen themselves politically. But such restraint was often seen as unusual. More commonly, war and enslavement fed each other after the battle, rather than always causing the battle in the first place. In Central Africa, civil wars, frontier conflict, and state expansion created similar opportunities. The long instability in Congo after a dynastic crisis weakened royal authority and created space for armed men who operated at the border between politics and banditry. Some became notorious for seizing people to sell overseas, while still claiming political legitimacy or connections. Elsewhere, wars along the Portuguese frontier and the westward movement of inland empires were observed by contemporaries through the lens of slave capture, though the local political stakes were often deeper than outside observers admitted. In some of these wars, the least enthusiastic adopters of firearms were nevertheless the ones most associated with seizing captives for export, showing once again that no simple technological formula explains the whole pattern. The broad history of African warfare in the Atlantic world, therefore, resists easy reduction. European trade and weapons mattered, but they did not create African politics from nothing. Africans fought for dynastic survival, for tribute, for territory, for control of trade routes, for political dominance, and for security against rivals. They made use of the terrain available to them, whether desert, savanna, forest, lagoon, or river. They adopted new weapons when it suited their needs and ignored or reshaped them when older methods still worked. The slave trade did not explain every war, but it changed the rewards of victory and deepened the human consequences of defeat. Captives were no longer only symbols of triumph, labour for local use, or subjects to be absorbed. They could now be converted into Atlantic wealth on a scale that altered the logic of conquest. To understand these wars is to see African societies not as passive victims of outside pressure, but as active participants in a brutal and changing world. Their leaders debated tactics, balanced alliances, adapted to ecological limits, and responded to new opportunities and dangers with strategic intelligence. Some built cavalry states in the savannah. Others refined infantry warfare in the forests. Some ruled waterways through marine power. All of them operated within military traditions that were as serious and as historically consequential as those of any other part of the early modern world. In the middle of the 15th century, two different historical worlds reached turning points at almost the same moment. In Western Europe, the long and exhausting struggle known as the 100 Years' War was finally coming to an end, closing a chapter of medieval rivalry between powerful monarchies. Far to the east, however, another dramatic event unfolded. The Eastern Roman Empire, weakened by centuries of conflict and internal division, faced the rising power of the Ottoman state. When the Ottoman armies captured Constantinople in 1453, the city that had stood for 1,000 years as the centre of Eastern Christianity fell, bringing the Byzantine Empire to its final end. The meaning of this event was powerful and symbolic for both sides of the Mediterranean world. In Christian Europe, the fall of Constantinople became a lasting image of the destruction of a refined Christian civilization by a feared enemy long associated with the Crusades. The memory of the Turk as a dangerous adversary had been embedded in European imagination since the 11th century, and the loss of the great imperial city confirmed those anxieties. In the Muslim world, the same event carried an entirely different meaning. For centuries, Muslim rulers had attempted to conquer the city that stood at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. Its capture was therefore seen as the fulfillment of a long historical ambition and a dramatic triumph for Islamic power. Beyond its religious symbolism, the conquest of Constantinople also marked a turning point in the history of warfare. The siege demonstrated the growing importance of gunpowder technology on the battlefield. The enormous cannons used by the Ottomans battered the massive defensive walls that had protected the city for centuries. Without this new destructive power, breaching the walls would have been extraordinarily difficult, perhaps even impossible. At roughly the same time, European warfare was also undergoing change. The Hundred Years' War is often described as the final stage of medieval chivalric combat and the beginning of a new era dominated by centralized monarchies that increasingly relied on new weapons and organized armies. Only relatively recently have historians begun to place the Ottoman experience fully within this wider transformation of warfare. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire stood between Europe and the Middle East, controlling the vital passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Yet European historical writing often treated the empire as something outside the normal development of European history. Instead of being integrated into broader narratives of state formation and military change, the Ottoman world was often portrayed simply as the eastern rival of Europe. This separation was reinforced by later nationalist histories as well. In the Balkans, which remained under Ottoman rule for nearly 5 centuries, historians often preferred to focus on pre-Ottoman traditions in order to build modern national identities. Turkish Republican historians sometimes adopted a similar approach, turning their attention away from the imperial past. The result was that surprisingly little detailed work was produced on the Ottoman military system, even though Ottoman armies, particularly the Janissaries, were feared across Europe for generations. Because of this absence of the Ottoman perspective, many early interpretations of Ottoman warfare relied heavily on European diplomatic correspondence and the writings of travellers. These sources often produced a distorted picture. A common assumption suggested that the Ottoman military system had stopped evolving after the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century and that the empire survived only because European powers preserved it during the 19th century. According to this view, the Ottoman rulers had simply occupied Constantinople like nomadic conquerors and remained there unchanged until the empire finally collapsed during the First World War. Another persistent misunderstanding came from the habit of calling the Ottomans simply Turks. This label had developed during the Crusades when Europeans used the word as a general term for Muslim enemies. In reality, the Ottoman ruling elite was far more diverse. The mothers of many Ottoman sultans came from Circassian, Georgian, Slavic, or Greek backgrounds. The Ottoman court itself was shaped by a mixture of cultures from across the Middle East and the Mediterranean. Arabic, Persian, and Turkish languages were all influential, and people of many ethnic origins could become part of the imperial system as long as they accepted Islam and entered the political culture of the dynasty. These misconceptions also affected the study of Ottoman warfare. Histories often emphasize difference rather than similarity between Ottoman and European military systems. Yet when examined more closely, the Ottoman experience reveals many of the same developments that historians identify elsewhere in early modern warfare. These include the growth of permanent professional troops, the increasing importance of military technology, the use of foreign specialists and advisors, and the limitations imposed by the economic resources of pre-industrial societies. The history of Ottoman warfare can therefore be understood through several major phases. The first stage was the formative era between 1300 and 1453, when the Ottoman state emerged from a frontier society in northwestern Anatolia. The second stage began with the conquest of Constantinople and lasted until the death of Suleiman in 1566, a period often described as the height of Ottoman imperial power. The third stage stretched from the late 16th century to the end of the 17th century, when the empire encountered the limits of its expansion. A final phase followed in which the Ottomans increasingly sought compromise and adaptation, in response to changing political and military realities. During the late 13th century, the lands around Constantinople were still largely controlled by the Byzantine Empire. Yet Byzantine authority had weakened dramatically. Religious divisions between Catholic and Orthodox Christianity had fractured the political unity of the region. At the same time, numerous Muslim states were rising in Anatolia and the eastern Mediterranean. The Seljuk Turks, whose power was centered in central Anatolia, commanded armies that relied heavily on highly mobile cavalry archers, capable of devastating attacks with the composite bow. The Balkans were equally unstable. Rival kingdoms in Bulgaria, Serbia, and Hungary competed for influence, while smaller rulers struggled to maintain their independence. In such an environment, skilled warriors were always in demand, and mercenary service became common. The Ottoman Principality emerged within this turbulent frontier world. The early Ottomans were originally one of several small states, linked loosely to the declining Seljuk political system. Their leader Osman controlled territory close to the Byzantine frontier and the routes leading toward Constantinople and the Balkans. During the late 13th and early 14th centuries, Osman gathered bands of warriors known as Ghazis. Fighters, motivated both by religious enthusiasm and by the promise of plunder and land. Victories against Byzantine forces increased Osman's reputation and attracted new followers. His successor, Orhan, consolidated these gains and established the first Ottoman capital at Bursa. Expansion continued gradually, helped by shifting alliances and by the fact that Byzantine rulers sometimes employed Ottoman forces as allies in their own internal struggles. By the middle of the 14th century, the Ottomans had crossed into Europe and established a permanent foothold in the Balkans. Under Murad, the first Ottoman raids evolved into organized campaigns aimed at territorial expansion. The famous Battle of Kosovo in 1389 symbolized the growing strength of the dynasty in southeastern Europe. From this point onward, the Ottomans increasingly directed their attention toward the fertile agricultural lands of the Balkans, which would later become vital to supplying their imperial capital. Ottoman political organization reflected both Central Asian traditions and Islamic ideas of rulership. The state was viewed as the personal domain of the Sultan, whose court functioned like an extended household. Society was divided into those who ruled and those who were ruled. The ruling class, known as the askeri, consisted largely of soldiers and administrators who served the Sultan. The majority of the population formed the reaya, the tax-paying subjects who supported the state. The army itself reflected this household structure. When the Sultan went to war, his court accompanied him, forming the central command of the army. Military formations were arranged around the Sultan's tent, which stood at the center of the battlefield. Elite infantry guarded the center, while cavalry wings extended outward on both sides in a crescent formation. The main striking force of the Ottoman army was the cavalry known as sipahis. These warriors received land grants called taimars in exchange for military service. They were expected to equip themselves and appear for campaign whenever the Sultan called. Success in battle could bring larger grants, while failure to serve could result in the loss of land. Alongside these provincial cavalry stood the Sultan's household troops. The most famous of these were the Janissaries, a professional infantry corps formed through a unique recruitment system. Christian boys from the Balkans were periodically taken, converted to Islam, and trained for service in the imperial household. Most became soldiers, while a smaller number received advanced education and entered the administrative elite of the empire. By the late 14th century, the Janissaries had become a disciplined corps of infantry loyal directly to the Sultan. Their numbers gradually increased, and they received regular salaries, clothing, and weapons. Garrisons of Janissaries were stationed in major fortresses along the empire's frontiers. Other auxiliary troops also played important roles. Locally recruited soldiers guarded roads and mountain passes, built fortifications, and sometimes served as naval forces. Irregular cavalry units conducted raids ahead of the main army, harassing enemy territory and gathering intelligence. The Ottomans also benefited from alliances with the Crimean Tatars, whose cavalry forces could provide enormous numbers of mounted warriors. These troops were especially effective in mobile warfare and raids across the frontier regions. Another key element in Ottoman expansion was naval power. Control of the Dardanelles and the Black Sea required a capable fleet. By the late 15th century, the Ottomans had built a navy of galleys capable of transporting soldiers and artillery and supporting military operations along the coasts. By the time Mehmed II prepared to attack Constantinople, the Ottoman military system already combined cavalry, infantry, artillery, and logistical organization in a remarkably effective way. The city itself had been weakened by political divisions, declining population, and rivalry between foreign merchant communities. When Ottoman forces surrounded the city in 1453, its defenders were already struggling to maintain unity. The successful siege transformed the Ottoman state. Constantinople became the new imperial capital and was rebuilt as a thriving metropolis within a few decades. Mehmed II continued expanding Ottoman authority across the Balkans and Anatolia, laying the foundation for an empire that would dominate much of southeastern Europe and the eastern Mediterranean for centuries. The century that followed was a period of remarkable growth. Ottoman armies advanced across the Balkans, conquered major cities such as Belgrade, defeated Hungarian forces at Mohacs, and expanded into North Africa and the Middle East. In the east, they confronted the Safavid Empire of Iran, while in the Mediterranean they competed with the Habsburg powers of Spain and Austria. This period also witnessed the expansion of Ottoman military institutions. Artillery units grew in size and importance. Specialized corps managed the casting of cannons, the production of weapons, and the transport of artillery in the field. Mines and foundries across the empire produced the raw materials needed for gunpowder warfare. Campaigns during this era required enormous logistical preparation. Orders for mobilization were issued months in advance. Soldiers from across the empire gathered along the main campaign routes before marching toward distant battlefields. Supply systems relied on networks of warehouses, local markets, and contributions from towns and villages. Despite its successes, the Ottoman system also faced increasing pressures. Inflation, rising military costs, and political struggles within the palace gradually weakened the stability that had characterized the earlier period. By the late 16th century, the empire began encountering limits to its expansion and new challenges both on its European frontiers and in the Middle East. In the Ottoman capital, uprisings among soldiers and urban factions were not unusual. When unrest broke out, the palace often tried to calm the situation by meeting the demands of the rebels. Powerful officials might be dismissed or executed, wealth distributed to restless troops, and sometimes even the ruler himself could be removed. In the middle of the 17th century, however, events took a different turn. An elderly but highly respected statesman, Mehmed Köprülü, was granted extraordinary authority as Grand Vizier. Once he secured full control of the government, he moved with remarkable speed. Rivals in the military and the religious establishment were expelled or stripped of their property, and trusted followers from his own circle were placed in positions of influence. Order returned to the capital, and the government regained a measure of stability. The new leadership soon demonstrated its strength beyond the walls of the city. Strategic islands in the Aegean that had fallen into Venetian hands were recovered, and control of the straits was reinforced. Rebellions led by provincial commanders were crushed through a mixture of force and political skill. The authority established by Mehmed Köprülü did not vanish after his death. His son, Fazıl Ahmed, continued the same determined style of leadership and preserved the family's influence within the imperial administration. The state still possessed the capacity to recover from crisis, rebuild its institutions, and project power abroad. A generation earlier, the Ottomans had suffered a devastating defeat at sea, yet their fleet had been reconstructed within a short time. The empire still had resources, experience, and resilience. Despite this, the maritime policy of the Ottoman state has often been misunderstood or dismissed. Yet several major decisions reveal that naval power was always a serious concern. The capture of Rhodes early in the 16th century removed a dangerous base used by hostile forces close to the Ottoman coastline. Diplomatic cooperation with France during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent led to an unusual moment when an Ottoman fleet spent the winter in a French port, strengthening political ties between the two powers and opening new trade arrangements that favoured French merchants. Naval expeditions were also launched in the Red Sea and the Arabian Peninsula to challenge Portuguese expansion along the routes of Indian Ocean trade. These actions show that Ottoman leaders understood the importance of maritime strength and sea routes that connected the empire's vast territories. Ambitious strategic ideas also appeared during this period. One proposal aimed to connect two major rivers through a canal so that ships could pass from one inland sea to another. The plan was bold and imaginative, but the technology and resources of the time made it impossible to complete. The dream would not be realized until centuries later. Even so, such projects reveal how Ottoman statesmen thought about geography, trade, and military mobility on a very large scale. The conquest of Cyprus in the late 16th century required a massive mobilization of both land forces and naval power. The operation alarmed other Mediterranean states, which formed a coalition fleet under the command of a Habsburg prince. In one of the largest naval clashes of the era, hundreds of ships confronted one another. The Ottoman fleet suffered enormous losses, with the majority of its vessels destroyed. Yet the disaster did not end Ottoman sea power. Within months, the empire began constructing a new fleet, and before long, the navy once again sailed the Mediterranean. The island of Cyprus remained under Ottoman control, demonstrating how quickly the state could recover from even catastrophic defeat. A longer and more exhausting contest unfolded over the island of Crete. For decades, Venice and the Ottoman Empire struggled for control of this large and strategically vital territory. The conflict stretched across many years of warfare, involving fleets, sieges, and reinforcements from across Europe. Venice received assistance from several Catholic powers, while the Ottomans were forced to fight on multiple fronts at once. In the north, they had to guard their Black Sea coastline against raids by Cossack forces that sometimes reached even the waters near the imperial capital. At the same time, the empire pushed its influence farther northward, briefly extending control over territories beyond the Danube. Eventually, the Ottomans secured Crete after a prolonged siege, and the island remained an important source of agricultural goods for centuries afterward. By the 18th century, the balance of naval power had begun to change. Ottoman fleets continued to sail, but they rarely achieved the decisive successes of earlier centuries. In one dramatic episode, a Russian squadron unexpectedly entered the Aegean Sea and destroyed the Ottoman fleet in a sudden and devastating attack. The shock reverberated across Europe, demonstrating the growing reach of Russian power. Although the Ottomans again rebuilt their navy, the creation of a modern fleet would only occur much later during a new period of reform. During the later 17th century, the empire still managed to restore order in its finances and army while extending authority along the northern shores of the Black Sea. Yet this recovery was interrupted by a long and costly war against several European powers. The struggle that began in the early 1680s drew the Ottomans into a prolonged confrontation with Austria and its allies. This conflict shifted the strategic focus toward the Danube frontier and the northern approaches to the Black Sea, regions that would remain the central arena of rivalry for the next 2 centuries. The war opened with one of the most famous sieges in European history. Ottoman forces advanced deep into Central Europe and surrounded the city of Vienna. The operation came dangerously close to success, but the arrival of a relief army from Poland changed the course of events. A sudden attack from the rear shattered the Ottoman lines and forced a chaotic retreat. The battlefield was left scattered with equipment, weapons, and banners, many of which later became trophies displayed in European collections. The struggle continued for years. The fortress city of Buda resisted for a time before eventually falling to the advancing coalition forces. Ottoman troops withdrew southward, attempting to reorganize along new defensive lines. Reforming ministers tried to strengthen the army and restore discipline, but several of them lost their lives in battle during these desperate campaigns. Even so, Ottoman soldiers demonstrated considerable resilience, fighting stubbornly from fortified positions and refusing to surrender easily. Another decisive encounter occurred toward the end of the conflict. A European commander launched a surprise attack against an Ottoman army while it was crossing a river. The resulting disaster led to enormous casualties as soldiers were cut down or drowned in the water. The defeat revealed serious weaknesses in command and coordination. Eventually, both sides, exhausted by years of war and drained of financial resources, agreed to negotiate peace. The treaty that concluded the conflict marked a turning point in diplomacy. Large territories were surrendered, and for the first time the Ottoman state formally recognized other European rulers as equals in negotiation. A new diplomatic culture began to emerge. Instead of constant warfare and temporary truces, agreements increasingly established fixed borders and longer periods of peace. Diplomats and administrators gradually replaced generals as the key negotiators of international affairs. Observers who studied the Ottoman army during these campaigns noted both strengths and weaknesses. The empire could still mobilize large forces drawn from many different regions. Elite infantry units remained formidable, while provincial cavalry and irregular troops provided additional manpower. Yet critics pointed to serious problems in leadership, discipline, and tactical coordination. The army possessed courage and numbers, but the organization required to use those strengths effectively was often lacking. After the end of the 17th century, the Ottoman government faced repeated setbacks on the battlefield. These defeats gradually pushed the empire toward cautious adaptation and reform. Military confrontations with Russia and Austria revealed that European armies were changing rapidly. The Ottomans began to study foreign practices more closely, experimenting with new forms of training, organization, and weaponry. Diplomatic contacts increased as well, and Ottoman envoys were sent to European courts to observe political and military developments. One of the most striking moments of the early 18th century occurred during a confrontation with Russia along the banks of a major river. Ottoman forces surrounded the Russian army and held a clear advantage in numbers. Yet instead of destroying the trapped enemy, the Ottoman leadership chose negotiation and allowed the Russians to withdraw. Some observers later interpreted this decision as a missed opportunity, but others saw it as a cautious attempt to avoid further escalation and secure key fortresses along the frontier. During the same period, Russia was strengthening its army through new tactics and disciplined infantry formations, supported by mobile artillery. These developments were tested in wars against other European powers and gradually refined. The improved methods later proved highly effective in conflicts against the Ottoman Empire. Russian commanders used fast-moving artillery and coordinated infantry attacks to defeat much larger forces that lacked the same level of training and organization. The 18th century placed enormous strain on both empires. Russia mobilized huge numbers of soldiers through a harsh system of long-term conscription, drawing heavily on its rural population. Desertion and resistance to recruitment were constant problems. The Ottoman state relied more heavily on volunteers and temporary levies from the provinces, which allowed greater flexibility but sometimes resulted in uneven discipline and training. The Ottomans remained attached to older strategies based on fortress networks and defensive lines along major rivers. Massive fortification projects created a chain of strongholds stretching across southeastern Europe. These structures symbolized a shift toward a more defensive outlook, reflecting the growing difficulty of sustaining large-scale offensives. Warfare increasingly occurred near Ottoman territory, making the supply of armies more complicated and exposing local populations to the burdens of campaigning. Throughout the 18th century, Ottoman statesmen gradually recognized the need for deeper reform. Foreign experts were occasionally invited to reorganize specialized units, such as the artillery corps. New schools and training programs appeared, and experiments were made with modern equipment. Yet these efforts faced powerful resistance from entrenched institutions, especially the Janissary Corps, whose privileges and financial interests were closely tied to the existing system. Another challenge lay in the structure of the army itself. Official records often listed enormous numbers of soldiers, but many of these existed only on paper. Pay certificates circulated as financial instruments, creating profit for officials while obscuring the real size of the fighting force. In practice, far fewer troops were ready for active service. During major wars, the government increasingly relied on provincial recruits drawn from the countryside. These volunteers could be assembled in large numbers, sometimes reaching tens of thousands. Payment came from the central treasury, and enlistment periods were relatively short. Such arrangements allowed rapid mobilization but also strengthened local elites, who controlled taxation and recruitment in their districts. The consequences of these wars became painfully clear during a major conflict in the later 18th century. Despite fielding large armies, the Ottomans faced opponents whose troops were better trained and more tightly organized. In several battles, smaller Russian forces defeated much larger Ottoman armies. Thousands of soldiers died during chaotic retreats across rivers and marshlands as formations collapsed under pressure. Leadership problems, poor coordination, and weak supply systems contributed to these failures. Armies campaigning on their own territory often struggled to feed themselves, leading to famine and desertion. Although enormous quantities of food were prepared for campaigns, corruption and mismanagement frequently prevented supplies from reaching the troops who needed them. By the end of the century, reform had become unavoidable. Some Ottoman leaders attempted to create new military units, trained according to European methods. Young recruits from Anatolia were selected for these formations in the hope that they could form the core of a modern army. Yet resistance from conservative factions and hesitation within the palace undermined these efforts. When opposition erupted into open revolt, the ruler who had sponsored the reforms was overthrown. Only in the 19th century did more decisive transformation occur. A later sultan reorganized the military structure step by step, building a modern artillery corps and gradually weakening the old institutions that resisted change. When the moment finally arrived, the traditional Janissary Corps was dissolved and replaced by new forces trained and equipped along modern lines. By then, the empire had entered an entirely new era, shaped not only by internal reform, but also by the expanding ambitions of European powers, whose interests increasingly focused on the eastern Mediterranean and the lands of the Ottoman state. Between the middle of the 15th century and the early 19th century, the character of warfare in Europe changed in ways that reshaped the entire political map of the continent. These transformations did more than alter the way battles were fought. They gradually helped create a new system of political authority based on sovereign states of different sizes and strengths. Over time, these states did not simply compete within Europe. They projected their influence across the oceans and into distant continents, turning European conflict into a global phenomenon. The growth of these states was closely connected to their ability to organize and control violence. Rulers who successfully concentrated military power in their own hands gained decisive advantages over rivals. Populations were gradually disarmed while governments developed new ways to collect resources and convert economic production into military strength. Larger armies required greater administrative coordination, deeper taxation systems, and more reliable financial structures. Warfare was no longer the scattered activity of feudal lords and private bands of fighters. Instead, it increasingly became an organized activity, controlled by governments that claimed a monopoly over the legitimate use of force. Historians have long debated how to describe this transformation. One influential interpretation suggested that the changes in warfare during the early modern period were so dramatic that they amounted to a true revolution. According to this interpretation, developments in tactics, organization, and training fundamentally altered the balance between states and their enemies. The introduction of new methods of drilling and coordinating infantry units allowed armies to use gunpowder weapons far more effectively than before. These improvements helped make battlefield victories more decisive and encouraged rulers to expand their armies and strengthen the institutions required to support them. Later interpretations placed greater emphasis on technology itself. Firearms, artillery, and new defensive structures began to reshape military operations. Fortresses were redesigned to resist cannon fire, while armies needed more soldiers to attack and defend these stronger positions. The scale of warfare expanded as states mobilized greater resources. These developments also had consequences far beyond Europe. Armed with new weapons and supported by organized military systems, European forces encountered societies in other parts of the world with a technological advantage that often proved decisive. Small numbers of soldiers sometimes succeeded in conquering large empires because their weapons, tactics, and discipline differed so greatly from those of their opponents. Despite the appeal of the idea of a single military revolution, many scholars later questioned whether such a simple explanation could capture the complexity of the historical process. The changes unfolded gradually over several centuries, rather than appearing suddenly. Instead of one dramatic turning point, the transformation of warfare occurred through several distinct phases, each connected to wider political and social developments. The first of these phases unfolded between the middle of the 15th century and the early decades of the 16th century. During this period, gunpowder weapons spread across European battlefields and began to alter the composition of armies. The second phase emerged during the later 17th century, when governments created larger, permanent armies supported by more developed administrative systems. The final stage occurred during the upheavals associated with the French Revolution, when states began mobilizing entire populations and dramatically increasing the scale of warfare. These changes did not affect every region in the same way or at the same speed. Even before the introduction of gunpowder weapons, medieval warfare had already evolved over centuries. Professional mercenaries had been employed by many rulers since at least the 12th century. The transition to the early modern military world therefore built upon older foundations, rather than replacing them entirely. Understanding the transformation of warfare requires attention to several interconnected factors. One involves the internal structure of the state itself. Governments gradually expanded their authority over defined territories and populations, using military power both to defend their rule and to establish clear political boundaries. Another factor lies in the international system formed by relations between these states. Wars determined which political entities survived and which disappeared from the map. A third element concerns the conduct of war itself. Conflicts differed in their duration, intensity, and geographic scope. The final issue concerns the forces driving change in these areas, including technological developments, economic growth, political ambition, and ideological shifts. The roots of the new European military system can be traced to the decades before the 16th century. Many innovations later associated with early modern warfare were already underway. Among them, the most important was the spread of gunpowder weapons. Although gunpowder had been used in Europe for more than a century, its effective military application required specialized knowledge and expensive equipment. Early firearms possessed certain advantages over traditional weapons such as bows and crossbows. Handguns fired more slowly but had greater penetrating power, while cannon could damage stone fortifications that had previously resisted attack. Yet these weapons also suffered serious limitations. They were unreliable in bad weather, difficult to supply with ammunition, and slow to reload. Early handguns were particularly ill-suited for cavalry warfare, which remained the dominant form of combat in many armies. For gunpowder technology to become effective, two conditions were necessary. Political authorities needed sufficient power to gather the resources required to produce weapons and maintain them in large numbers. At the same time, armies required disciplined infantry, capable of using these weapons effectively. Soldiers, armed with long pikes, played an important role in protecting early gunners from cavalry attacks. Large formations of pikemen, operating in coordinated groups, became a central feature of many European armies. One of the earliest and most famous examples of these tactics appeared in the armies of Switzerland. Swiss infantry organized themselves into powerful blocks of pikemen, capable of resisting cavalry charges and advancing against enemy troops. Their formations could support one another in battle while maximizing their collective striking power. Handgunners were positioned around these formations where they could fire safely and withdraw under protection if threatened. These developments had immediate political consequences. In many regions, they strengthened rulers who were attempting to centralize authority. Medieval Europe had been characterized by complex networks of overlapping obligations, linking kings, nobles, cities, and religious institutions. Military power was often dispersed among these competing authorities. The new military technologies favored those leaders who could concentrate resources and organize armies on a larger scale. Even so, Europe had not yet developed fully sovereign states. Political power remained divided among many actors. Feudal obligations, economic privileges, and religious institutions all limited the authority of individual rulers. The Catholic Church, in particular, maintained a powerful transnational influence that complicated the consolidation of political control. In many regions, governments did not yet possess exclusive control over taxation, justice, or military power. Nobles, cities, and regional assemblies often retained the ability to influence political decisions and sometimes to challenge the authority of the ruler. The question of who truly controlled the instruments of power remained unresolved across much of Europe. As a result, the creation of centralized states was not inevitable. It emerged from a long struggle between competing forces within society. Rulers who succeeded in mastering new military technologies gained an important advantage. Their ability to extract taxes and mobilize manpower allowed them to build armies capable of defeating rivals and consolidating authority. Economic changes also played a significant role. The gradual expansion of monetary exchange made it easier for governments to collect taxes in money rather than goods. This shift enabled rulers to accumulate financial resources and hire professional soldiers, rather than relying solely on feudal obligations. The Italian city-states were among the first to exploit these developments, using their commercial wealth to maintain relatively permanent military forces. Elsewhere, similar processes unfolded through major political conflicts. In France, the monarchy gradually expelled foreign influence and absorbed surrounding territories, strengthening royal authority. In Spain, the final stages of the Reconquista removed Muslim rule from the Iberian Peninsula and allowed the creation of a unified Christian kingdom. In England, dynastic conflict ended with the emergence of a more centralized monarchy under a new ruling dynasty. Interestingly, many of these political consolidations were achieved with armies that still resembled medieval forces. Heavily armoured cavalry and traditional infantry remained important elements of warfare. Gunpowder weapons had not yet completely transformed battlefield tactics. Nevertheless, rulers increasingly recognized that control over artillery and firearms was essential for defending their power. Governments, therefore, began restricting private access to such weapons. Artillery became a symbol of state authority, and private individuals were often forbidden to construct strong fortifications or maintain heavy weapons. Political debates gradually shifted away from armed conflict over territory toward disputes about taxation and the resources needed to sustain armies under central control. By the early 16th century, the outcome of this state-building process was still uncertain. Some rulers lacked the administrative capacity to maintain permanent armies, while local elites retained significant power. Religious conflict added further complications after the emergence of new Christian doctrines that challenged the authority of the established church. The religious divisions that followed reshaped European politics. Competing confessions became linked to emerging political identities, and rulers often sought to enforce religious uniformity within their territories. The alliance between political authority and religious institutions played a crucial role in legitimizing centralized power. The political consequences varied widely across Europe. In the Holy Roman Empire and Poland, the absence of strong hereditary monarchies limited attempts to establish centralized control. Regional princes and nobles retained substantial autonomy, preventing the formation of unified national military systems. In Russia, by contrast, rulers expanded their authority by creating a service class of cavalry soldiers, tied directly to the state through land grants. The international system of warfare was also influenced by these developments. Distinctions between internal and external conflicts remained blurred. Religious struggles frequently crossed political boundaries and drew foreign powers into domestic disputes. Nevertheless, the fragmentation of medieval Christendom gradually gave way to a system of separate states competing for power. Ideas about the morality of war were also evolving. Medieval Christian teachings had distinguished between just and unjust wars. Legitimate conflicts were expected to follow moral principles, including proper authority, reasonable cause, and humane conduct. Wars against non-Christian peoples were often justified under these principles, but conflicts between Christian rulers raised more complex questions about legitimacy. As rulers strengthened their authority, they increasingly claimed the exclusive right to wage war. Armed resistance against the government was portrayed as rebellion rather than legitimate opposition. At the same time, legal institutions expanded in order to settle disputes that might once have led to private warfare. Religious division complicated these developments. After the Reformation, it became possible to justify wars against other Christian groups on the basis of confessional differences. Religious identity thus intensified political conflict across the continent. The transformation of warfare was also visible in the scale of armies. By the early 16th century, major European states were capable of fielding forces numbering tens of thousands of soldiers. These armies consisted largely of professional fighters who could campaign repeatedly over several years. Such forces represented a significant increase compared with earlier medieval conflicts. Technology alone did not explain this growth. Larger armies became possible because centralized governments could mobilize greater economic resources and larger populations. Demographic recovery after earlier crises and expanding trade networks provided the manpower and wealth necessary to sustain military expansion. Differences in regional geography and social structure also influenced the composition of armies. Some regions produced large numbers of cavalry, while others specialized in infantry. France initially relied heavily on mounted knights, whereas Spanish armies included larger numbers of foot soldiers. Eastern European states often deployed swift light cavalry, suited to vast open landscapes. Certain regions became famous for particular types of soldiers. Swiss infantry gained a reputation for disciplined, pike formations capable of defeating traditional cavalry armies. Their skills made them highly sought after as mercenaries by many European rulers. German mercenary infantry developed similar tactics and fought in conflicts across the continent. Mounted soldiers also evolved during this period. Some cavalry units carried firearms in addition to traditional weapons, attempting to combine mobility with increased firepower. Other formations specialized in reconnaissance, raiding, and harassment rather than direct combat. These varied military traditions collided during a series of major conflicts that drew many European powers into prolonged struggles. Campaigns in Italy during the late 15th and early 16th centuries exposed armies from different regions to new tactics and technologies. Victory often depended on the ability to combine infantry, cavalry, and artillery effectively rather than relying on a single form of combat. Battles during this era were often extremely bloody because armies fought at close range with weapons that required direct contact or short distances. Casualties could be enormous, and even victorious armies sometimes lost large portions of their soldiers. Such losses limited the ability of rulers to exploit victories fully, contributing to the prolonged and intermittent nature of many wars. As warfare continued to evolve, governments experimented with new ways to recruit and train soldiers. Some states attempted to organize militias drawn from the population to supplement professional forces. Others maintained permanent units of soldiers paid directly by the crown. These developments marked the gradual emergence of a new military system, combining professional troops with broader national resources. During the 18th century, European armies developed increasingly structured systems of training and organization. Infantry drill became highly standardized. Soldiers were expected to move, load, and fire in precise patterns that could be repeated again and again across different regiments. This emphasis on uniform discipline allowed large formations of infantry to act together as a single force on the battlefield. Cavalry, however, remained far less uniform. Mounted troops continued to perform a variety of roles that required different types of training and equipment. Heavy cavalry rode powerful horses and often wore protective armour such as metal breastplates and reinforced caps beneath their hats. These units were intended to deliver decisive charges at critical moments in battle, exploiting weaknesses in the enemy line and turning tactical opportunity into victory. Other mounted formations fulfilled different functions. Dragoons had originally been trained as soldiers who could ride quickly to a battlefield and then dismount to fight on foot. Over time, their role changed, and they were increasingly used as shock cavalry, similar to heavier mounted troops. As dragoons shifted toward this role, lighter forms of cavalry became more important for scouting, skirmishing, and screening the movements of the main army. Many of these light cavalry units drew inspiration from Eastern European models, particularly the fast-moving hussars, whose mobility and aggressive tactics had proven highly effective in irregular warfare. The greatest specialization in 18th century armies appeared among the supporting branches that worked alongside infantry and cavalry. Artillery had become an essential part of military operations and was divided into different categories depending on the types of guns and the tasks they performed. Some units handled heavy cannons designed for siege warfare, while others operated lighter pieces that could move with field armies. Engineering units also became increasingly important. Specialists trained in construction, mining, and demolition worked to break through fortress walls or undermine defensive structures. Sappers prepared trenches and protective works during sieges, while pontoon units built temporary bridges that allowed armies to cross rivers quickly during campaigns. In some regions, specialized naval detachments even supported land operations along major rivers. Fleets of armed boats patrolled waterways and assisted military campaigns by transporting troops and supplies or attacking enemy positions along the riverbanks. Despite the growing importance of professional soldiers, militias and irregular forces continued to play a major role across Central and Eastern Europe. Many states lacked the financial resources necessary to maintain large, permanent armies in peacetime, so they relied on local populations to provide additional manpower during war. One notable example emerged along the long frontier between the Habsburg monarchy and the Ottoman world. Over generations, this border region developed into a militarized zone inhabited by settlers who enjoyed special rights and privileges in return for defending the frontier. These communities served as guards against enemy incursions and gradually became a reservoir of experienced light infantry who could be mobilized during larger wars. Elsewhere, governments created systems that combined permanent regiments with temporary service. In many German territories, soldiers who had completed basic training were released back into civilian life for most of the year. This arrangement allowed governments to maintain a trained pool of manpower without bearing the full cost of supporting large standing forces. Soldiers might spend months working as craftsmen, labourers, or farmhands before returning periodically for military duties. Even those formally assigned to active regiments often served only part of the week, supplementing their modest military pay with civilian employment. One of the most distinctive examples of this mixed system appeared in the military organisation developed in Prussia during the early 18th century. The state divided its territory into districts assigned to particular regiments. Each district provided recruits who received training and then returned to civilian life until they were needed for active service. This system allowed the government to maintain a professional corps of soldiers while drawing upon a much larger reserve of partially trained men. Similar arrangements appeared in other European countries, though many states still kept militia forces separate from their regular armies and used them mainly to guard fortresses or maintain order behind the front lines. Russia followed a different path. Earlier systems that relied on smaller units of professional soldiers supported by cavalry from the landowning class proved too expensive to maintain. In the early 18th century, the Russian state introduced a system of mass recruitment drawn from the rural population. Men selected through this process entered military service for life. This created enormous armies that could be mobilized across vast territories, while militia-style forces were largely confined to guarding distant frontier regions. By the early 18th century, these different military systems had largely settled into stable patterns. After the long wars that marked the turn of the century, European armies entered a period characterized more by consolidation than by dramatic innovation. Armies across the continent increasingly resembled one another in their methods of training, battlefield formations, organizational structures, and even the appearance of their uniforms. Change during this period usually involved refining existing techniques, rather than introducing entirely new forms of warfare. Nevertheless, important developments began to appear during several major conflicts in the middle of the century. Commanders experimented with organizing their armies into intermediate formations larger than individual regiments, but smaller than the entire army. These formations allowed generals to maneuver troops across broader areas and concentrate forces rapidly at key points on the battlefield. Columns of soldiers could move separately and then unite to deliver coordinated attacks. Artillery also became more closely integrated with battlefield tactics. Instead of firing only during the opening stages of an engagement, heavy guns increasingly accompanied advancing troops and continued firing throughout the battle. Their sustained bombardment could weaken enemy defences and support infantry assaults. Some armies began experimenting with lighter artillery pieces that could move quickly across the battlefield, sometimes even keeping pace with cavalry units. Light infantry also gained greater importance. These soldiers operated ahead of the main battle line, harassing enemy formations, gathering intelligence, and disrupting movements. Although these innovations did not yet transform warfare completely, they laid the groundwork for the more dramatic changes that would emerge later. Meanwhile, the balance of power across Europe continued to shift. Britain expanded its global influence primarily through naval strength and financial resources, rather than through massive land armies. Its fleets allowed it to project power across oceans and support military operations far from Europe. In contrast, the great monarchies of Eastern and Central Europe remained primarily land powers whose strength rested on large armies. Russia in particular emerged as a major military force during the 18th century. Its armies began appearing far beyond their traditional areas of operation, intervening in conflicts across northern and central Europe. Although distance and logistical difficulties still limited the reach of Russian campaigns, the sheer size of its conscript army made the empire a dominant power across Eastern Europe and the Balkans by the late 18th century. The Habsburg monarchy also expanded significantly during this period. Territorial gains and military reforms allowed it to develop a large standing army capable of independent action, rather than relying solely on its influence within the complex political structure of the Holy Roman Empire. By the end of the century, the Habsburg armed forces numbered hundreds of thousands of soldiers, excluding the frontier militia that guarded its eastern borders. Another rising power was Prussia. Its survival during a major mid-century war against a coalition of enemies demonstrated that it had become far more than a regional state. Prussia's army grew rapidly over the course of the 18th century, transforming the kingdom into a formidable military power, despite its relatively limited economic resources. Population growth across Europe also contributed to the expansion of military forces. Increasing numbers of people meant that states could potentially draw upon larger pools of manpower. where governments possessed effective administrative systems. They could convert these demographic changes into greater military strength. The full implications of these developments became clear only after the upheaval that began in France at the end of the century. Political revolution shattered the traditional structures of authority and introduced new ideas about citizenship, national identity, and political participation. These changes affected warfare less through new tactics than through the way states organized their societies to sustain conflict. The collapse of older institutions removed many barriers that had previously limited the state's ability to mobilize resources. Local privileges and feudal obligations were abolished, and central authority extended deeper into society. Governments could now reach directly into communities to collect taxes, recruit soldiers, and direct economic activity toward military purposes. At the same time, new political ideas encouraged broader participation in the state. The concept of the nation created a powerful justification for military service, linking individual duty to the defense of a larger collective identity. These ideas allowed governments to mobilize far larger armies than had previously been possible. Initially, revolutionary France attempted to rely on volunteers to defend the new political order. It soon became clear that this approach could not sustain the scale of warfare that followed. Within a few years, the government introduced compulsory military service. Young men were drafted each year to replenish the ranks of the army, creating forces far larger than those maintained by most earlier regimes. These armies achieved remarkable successes against the monarchies that opposed them, though their victories did not result solely from enthusiasm or ideological commitment. In many battles, French forces simply possessed local numerical superiority. Their commanders were also willing to accept heavier casualties and to exploit the resources of conquered territories to sustain their campaigns. Opposing states initially fought according to earlier conventions that placed limits on the conduct of war. They sought territorial concessions or political adjustments, rather than the complete destruction of their enemies. The relentless ambition of revolutionary France gradually forced them to reconsider these assumptions. One of the most dramatic challenges to French dominance came from Russia. When Napoleon launched a massive invasion in the early 19th century, Russian forces avoided decisive battle, and instead withdrew deep into their own territory. This strategy stretched French supply lines and exposed the invading army to enormous hardship. The campaign ended in catastrophe, demonstrating that even the most powerful military systems could fail when confronted with vast distances and determined resistance. Other European states also adapted in response to French successes. They reformed their armies, improved their administrative structures, and sought ways to mobilize greater resources without completely abandoning their traditional political institutions. By the early 19th century, the long evolution of European warfare had produced a distinctive system. The continent was divided into sovereign states, each controlling its own military forces and administrative structures. Internal political conflicts were increasingly separated from the conduct of war, which became the responsibility of professional armies serving centralized governments. These armies remained permanent institutions supported by complex bureaucracies and financial systems. Officers, administrators, and soldiers alike became specialists in their professions. The massive conscript forces raised during the revolutionary period were later reduced, reflecting concerns about political stability and the costs of maintaining such enormous armies in peacetime. For centuries, technological innovation had played an important role in shaping the development of warfare. Yet after the early spread of gunpowder weapons, human ambition and political organization became the primary drivers of change. The ability of states to mobilize resources and coordinate large societies proved more decisive than any single weapon. At the beginning of the 16th century, Spain emerged as one of the most formidable military powers in Europe. The kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula had recently completed the long struggle against the remaining Muslim states, bringing most of the peninsula under Spanish authority. At the same time, the Spanish monarchy gained influence far beyond Iberia through dynastic unions and political control over territories in Central Europe, the Low Countries, and parts of Italy. Spanish expansion also moved across the Atlantic. Expeditions established footholds in the Caribbean and along the American mainland, reaching regions such as Panama and Florida. These early ventures did not always proceed smoothly. The peoples encountered in these new lands lived in societies very different from those familiar to Europeans. Their political structures did not easily allow control through alliances with existing rulers, and many communities simply withdrew or relocated when faced with foreign intrusion. During these same years, Spanish sailors and traders explored the islands of the Caribbean and the surrounding seas. Some vessels almost certainly reached the coasts of mainland America long before formal expeditions were organized, though such contacts left little documentation. Shipwreck survivors occasionally appeared among the local populations and lived for years within indigenous communities. Even so, systematic exploration of the region that Europeans would later call Mexico began only after expeditions organized from Cuba sailed westward across the Gulf. The first such expedition encountered fierce resistance from the coastal inhabitants of the Yucatan Peninsula. Many of the soldiers who landed there were killed or wounded, and the commander of the expedition died soon after returning to Cuba. Yet the survivors reported something extraordinary. Beyond the coast, they had glimpsed large towns, impressive buildings, and societies far more complex than those known on the Caribbean islands. Stories of gold and wealth soon circulated among the Spanish settlers. Encouraged by these reports, a second expedition was dispatched. Its commander followed the coastline northward, meeting local communities and occasionally fighting skirmishes with them. Although the expedition returned without major conquests, it confirmed that powerful societies existed on the mainland. Even before this second expedition came back, preparations were already underway for a third and far more ambitious venture. Leadership of this new expedition was given to Hernán Cortés. The governor of Cuba soon began to distrust Cortés and attempted to cancel the mission. Cortés acted quickly. Before the order could be enforced, he sailed with a small fleet of ships and several hundred soldiers. His forces stopped briefly at other Caribbean ports to gather additional men and supplies before heading toward the mainland. Early in the year 1519, the expedition set out across the Gulf of Mexico. When Cortés reached the coast of Yucatan, he encountered a Spaniard who had survived a shipwreck years earlier and had learned the language of the local Maya people. This unexpected meeting proved valuable. Communication with local societies became far easier, and Cortés gained a translator who could help him navigate unfamiliar political landscapes. Continuing along the coast, the expedition clashed with Maya communities, but eventually reached the shores of the central Mexican coast. This region was inhabited by the Totonac people, who lived under the influence of the powerful Aztec Empire. When the Spaniards arrived, they were met by emissaries from the Aztec ruler. Gifts of food and valuable items were offered, a gesture that reflected both curiosity and caution. The relationship quickly became strained, and the Aztec representatives soon withdrew. Their departure had unintended consequences. Without the presence of Aztec officials, local Totonac leaders began visiting the Spanish camp. These meetings revealed a crucial fact: many peoples in the region resented Aztec dominance and were willing to oppose it if an opportunity arose. Cortés immediately recognized the significance of this information. Within the Spanish camp, however, there was division. Some soldiers believed their mission was complete and wished to return to Cuba. Cortés resolved the issue through a bold political maneuver. He founded a new coastal settlement and declared it directly loyal to the Spanish king rather than to the governor of Cuba. The new municipal council then confirmed Cortés as the expedition's commander under royal authority. Through this legal fiction, Cortés freed himself from earlier instructions and gained greater independence in his decisions. An alliance with the Totonacs soon followed. At Cortés's urging, the Totonacs captured Aztec tribute collectors who had come to enforce imperial authority. This act marked an open rebellion against the Aztec state. Cortés also sent a ship back to Spain, carrying gold and other gifts in hopes of gaining royal favour for his enterprise. Facing dissent among his own soldiers, Cortés made a dramatic decision. The remaining ships were destroyed, leaving the expedition with no possibility of retreat. The soldiers now had only one option: follow their commander inland. The march toward the Aztec heartland began with a small Spanish force accompanied by Totonac allies and porters. The expedition advanced through unfamiliar territory toward the powerful city of Tenochtitlan. Along the way, they encountered another major regional power, the state of Tlaxcalan, which had long been an enemy of the Aztecs. Initial contact with Tlaxcaltec forces led to fierce fighting. Spanish soldiers were drawn into ambushes and suffered casualties. Yet their weapons proved devastating in close combat. Steel swords, crossbows, firearms, and cavalry charges inflicted heavy losses on their opponents. After several days of bitter fighting, both sides reconsidered their position. The Tlaxcaltecs realized that these foreigners possessed weapons that could disrupt enemy lines in ways unknown in Mesoamerican warfare. Rather than destroy the Spaniards, they chose to ally with them. This alliance proved decisive. Spanish numbers were extremely small, but their weapons and tactics could break enemy formations. Tlaxcaltec warriors could then exploit these openings with their much larger forces. The partnership multiplied the effectiveness of both sides. After remaining in Tlaxcalan for several weeks, the combined army marched onward. Their next destination was the city of Chololan. The Spaniards were initially welcomed by local leaders, but events soon turned violent. The nobles of the city were gathered in a central courtyard where they were suddenly attacked and killed. The massacre destroyed much of the city's leadership and altered the balance of power in the region. From there, the expedition entered the Valley of Mexico, a densely populated region dominated by the magnificent island city of Tenochtitlan. This vast metropolis stood in the middle of a lake and was connected to the mainland by long causeways. When Cortés arrived, he was greeted by the Aztec ruler Moctezuma, who welcomed the newcomers with ceremony and hospitality. Despite the formal welcome, tensions grew quickly. Cortés soon seized Moctezuma and ruled the city indirectly through him. For several months, the Spaniards lived within the capital while the emperor remained effectively a prisoner. The situation deteriorated when violence erupted during a religious festival. Spanish soldiers attacked a gathering of Aztec nobles inside the ceremonial precinct. The slaughter shocked the city. Soon, the population rose in revolt and surrounded the Spanish quarters. Cortés returned to the city after defeating a Spanish force sent to arrest him. His army was now larger, but the uprising had transformed the situation. The Spaniards found themselves trapped within the city. Fighting raged in the streets, and supplies began to run out. Eventually, they attempted a desperate escape under cover of darkness. Many were killed as they tried to cross the causeways leading from the island. The survivors struggled back to Tlaxcalan, where their allies received them once again. Both sides reconsidered their strategy. Direct occupation of the Aztec capital had failed. The next campaign would follow a different plan. Meanwhile, disaster struck the region in another form. A deadly epidemic spread among the population, killing enormous numbers of people and causing political turmoil throughout the Aztec world. Cortés used the time to rebuild his forces and secure additional alliances among cities hostile to Aztec authority. In Tlaxcalan, he ordered the construction of small ships that could be transported to the lakes surrounding Tenochtitlan. These vessels would later play a crucial role in the final campaign. By the end of the year, Cortés returned to the Valley of Mexico with hundreds of Spanish soldiers and tens of thousands of indigenous allies. Political divisions within the region now worked in his favor. Rival claimants to local thrones aligned themselves with the Spaniards, hoping to gain advantage over their enemies. The final campaign unfolded as a massive siege. The Spaniards and their allies attacked cities around the lake and gradually cut Tenochtitlan off from outside support. The ships built in Tlaxcalan were launched on the lake to challenge the fleets of Aztec war canoes that controlled the waters. Battles raged across the causeways and canals leading into the city. The Aztecs adapted quickly to Spanish weapons. They learned to avoid gunfire, built barricades against cavalry, and attacked horses from rooftops and boats. Despite these efforts, the siege tightened as food and fresh water supplies dwindled. Fighting continued for months. Thousands of warriors from allied cities joined the assault. Eventually, the defences of Tenochtitlan collapsed. The final Aztec ruler attempted to escape across the lake, but was captured. The great city fell after a brutal siege, leaving vast destruction in its wake. Although Spanish accounts later portrayed the conquest as a triumph of a small European force, the reality was far more complex. Tens of thousands of indigenous warriors fought on both sides of the conflict. Political rivalries within Mesoamerica played a decisive role in shaping the outcome. For many indigenous communities, the defeat of the Aztecs represented an opportunity to alter the balance of power within their own political world. The Spaniards provided new weapons and military techniques, but they were too few in number to conquer the region alone. Indigenous allies supplied the vast majority of soldiers, logistical support, and local knowledge. In this sense, the fall of the Aztec capital was not simply a foreign conquest. It was also the culmination of long-standing struggles among the societies of Mesoamerica themselves. The Spaniards ultimately gained control of the region, but the war that destroyed the Aztec Empire was fought largely by indigenous armies, pursuing their own political ambitions. Once the capital was destroyed, resistance collapsed across much of central Mexico. Many cities surrendered quickly, recognizing that the old imperial order had ended. Spanish authority gradually spread across the region, supported by alliances, new settlements, and the introduction of European institutions. Over time, Spanish rule reshaped the political and cultural landscape of Mesoamerica. Indigenous political structures were dismantled. New systems of land ownership were introduced, and European religious institutions replaced traditional belief systems. The world that had existed before the arrival of the Spaniards disappeared, replaced by a colonial society built upon entirely different foundations. Contact between European soldiers and the indigenous societies of North America began early in the 16th century. One of the first encounters occurred when a Spanish expedition led by Juan Ponce de León landed on the coast of Florida in 1513. Ponce de León had already taken part in earlier voyages to the Americas and had established Spanish control over Puerto Rico. His new expedition was motivated by the search for wealth and new territories. Instead of treasure, however, the Spanish encountered the Calusa, a powerful coastal people whose warriors drove the newcomers away with volleys of arrows. Despite their metal armor, horses, crossbows, and early firearms, Spanish expeditions found it difficult to defeat the societies of the southeastern part of North America. Throughout the 16th century, several more expeditions attempted to explore or settle the region. Some crossed vast distances through unfamiliar forests and river systems, but most ended in failure. Disease, starvation, shipwreck, and constant attacks from indigenous warriors destroyed many of these ventures. Florida and the surrounding lands became known among Spanish adventurers as a place of hardship and death, rather than quick conquest. Only in the middle of the century did Spain establish a lasting foothold on the Atlantic coast of North America. The construction of fortified settlements at St. Augustine created the first permanent European military presence in the region. From that moment forward, the struggle between European expansion and indigenous resistance would continue for centuries. Native communities of eastern North America fought to defend their lands well into the early 19th century. For much of this long period, European colonies remained fragile outposts along the coastline. English settlements appeared at Jamestown in Virginia and later at Plymouth in New England. The Dutch founded trading centres along the Hudson River, while the French established their colony at Quebec. A small Swedish colony briefly appeared along the Delaware River. Many of these early communities were weak and heavily dependent on their relationships with neighbouring indigenous peoples. Some settlements immediately triggered conflict with nearby tribes, especially when colonists attempted to claim large tracts of land. Others survived only because indigenous communities allowed them to exist. Certain colonies relied heavily on local alliances for food, trade, and security. In places where European settlers sought farmland on a large scale, tensions eventually turned into open warfare. The French presence developed in a different way. Rather than expanding through large agricultural settlements, French traders and missionaries travelled deep into the interior through river networks and the Great Lakes. Their influence depended less on conquest and more on diplomacy and trade relationships with indigenous nations. However, competition for control of the fur trade brought the French into a long and bitter conflict with the powerful Iroquois Confederacy. English expansion produced different consequences. Colonists in Virginia and New England steadily pushed outward in search of farmland. Their growing settlements placed increasing pressure on surrounding indigenous communities. During the 17th century, this expansion sparked a series of devastating wars across the eastern woodlands. Entire regions became battlefields as settlers and native nations struggled for survival. Large parts of the interior remained under indigenous control for much longer. The lands west of the Appalachian Mountains were especially contested. This region, later known as the Old Northwest, included territories that would eventually become several American states. Native confederacies fought to defend these lands until the late 18th century. One of the most decisive battles occurred in 1794, when a confederation of tribes was defeated by American forces at Fallen Timbers. Even after this defeat, resistance did not disappear. The final years of this long struggle were shaped by the leadership of the Shawnee warrior Tecumseh. Tecumseh believed that the only way to stop the expansion of the United States was for all indigenous nations of the eastern forests to unite. His vision was ambitious and far-reaching. He travelled widely, urging tribes across the region to abandon their divisions and join together in a common alliance. The death of Tecumseh during the War of 1812 dealt a devastating blow to that effort. Without his leadership, the dream of a unified indigenous resistance collapsed. Yet the centuries of warfare that preceded this moment demonstrate that native societies were far from passive victims of European expansion. Before European contact, the population of North America was far larger than once believed. Modern estimates vary widely, but many scholars agree that millions of people lived across the continent before the arrival of Europeans. Within a few generations, this population suffered a catastrophic decline. Epidemic diseases carried by Europeans spread rapidly through communities that had no previous exposure to them. Smallpox, measles, and other illnesses devastated entire regions. Some villages disappeared completely. Areas that had once supported thriving societies were found nearly deserted by later explorers and settlers. This demographic collapse weakened many indigenous communities, just as European colonies were beginning to expand. While native populations declined, European settlements grew through constant immigration and support from overseas. The balance of power gradually shifted. Even when European settlements struggled with famine, disease, and internal conflict, they could rely on reinforcements from across the Atlantic. Indigenous societies lacked similar external support. Over time, the growing population of colonists transformed the political and military landscape of Eastern North America. Economic change also reshaped indigenous life. The arrival of European traders created a new market for animal pelts, especially beaver. Many tribes became deeply involved in the fur trade. This new economic system brought European goods, such as metal tools, weapons, cloth, and firearms into indigenous communities. While these items offered advantages, they also created new dependencies and rivalries. Competition for control of the fur trade intensified conflicts between tribes. Some groups gained power through their access to trade networks, while others were pushed aside. In certain regions, the fur trade altered traditional ways of life as hunting for commercial purposes replaced older patterns of subsistence. Alcohol introduced through trade caused severe social disruption in many communities. Cultural change accompanied economic transformation. European missionaries attempted to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity. In some areas, these efforts succeeded among groups already weakened by disease and social upheaval. Conversion sometimes divided communities, creating factions aligned either with European religious teachings or with traditional beliefs. Such divisions could weaken resistance and create alliances between Christian converts and colonial authorities. Indigenous societies were also politically diverse. The eastern forests were home to dozens of distinct nations, each with its own language, traditions, and leadership structures. Many were organized around villages connected through kinship and cultural ties, rather than centralized governments. Authority often rested with councils of elders in times of peace and with war leaders during conflicts. Because these societies valued discussion and consensus, forming large and permanent military alliances was difficult. Rivalries between neighboring groups were common. Europeans frequently took advantage of these divisions, forming alliances with some tribes against others. Indigenous diplomacy could be just as complex as tribes sought to balance relationships with competing European powers. Despite these challenges, indigenous warriors proved formidable opponents on the battlefield. Their methods of warfare were adapted to the dense forests and rugged terrain of North America. Rather than fight in rigid formations, they relied on mobility, stealth, and surprise. Small war parties moved quickly through the woods, striking enemy settlements and disappearing before large forces could respond. European armies trained for open battlefields often struggled in these conditions. Soldiers accustomed to marching in tight formations found it difficult to fight enemies who attacked from hidden positions among trees and rocky ground. Indigenous warriors excelled at ambushes and hit-and-run tactics that disrupted larger armies. Physical endurance was another advantage. Warriors were accustomed to travelling long distances through wilderness, with minimal supplies. Forced marches covering dozens of miles in a single day were common. Hunger, cold, and exhaustion were treated as normal challenges rather than exceptional hardships. Training for war began early in life. Young men learned hunting skills that also prepared them for combat. Marksmanship, tracking, and survival in harsh environments were essential abilities. In many ways, these warriors resembled modern special forces trained for operations in difficult terrain. European soldiers who fought alongside indigenous allies often came to respect these skills. Many adopted local clothing and equipment better suited for forest warfare. Moccasins replaced heavy boots. Light clothing allowed greater mobility. Birch bark canoes made rapid travel along rivers and lakes possible. Snowshoes allowed winter campaigns across frozen landscapes. Firearms gradually transformed indigenous warfare. Early encounters introduced muskets to native communities, and by the late 17th century, many tribes possessed large numbers of these weapons. Although early firearms were slow and unreliable, they had advantages that made them attractive to indigenous warriors. Bullets travelled faster than arrows and were less likely to be deflected by branches or brush. Even though muskets were inaccurate by modern standards, skilled marksmen learned to use them effectively. Over time, indigenous warriors became some of the most feared shooters in North America. Rifles later appeared on the frontier and offered greater accuracy and range. These weapons suited the tactics of hunters and warriors who fought from concealed positions rather than in massed formations. Their use added a new level of danger for European soldiers moving through unfamiliar forests. Despite their skill with firearms, indigenous warriors faced limitations. Ammunition and gunpowder could only be produced in large quantities through European manufacturing. As a result, many tribes depended on trade for their supplies. Shortages of powder and shot sometimes forced war parties to abandon campaigns. Artillery remained almost entirely in European hands. Cannons could easily destroy wooden palisades that protected many indigenous villages. When faced with artillery, defenders often chose to abandon their settlements rather than risk annihilation. European armies frequently burned villages and crops in an attempt to force their enemies into submission through starvation. Indigenous warfare was often misunderstood by European observers. Raids, ambushes, and attacks on settlements seemed brutal and unpredictable to outsiders. Yet these tactics followed their own logic. Warriors aimed to weaken enemies while minimizing losses among their own people. Direct assaults against fortified positions were usually avoided. Prisoners captured during raids faced uncertain fates. Some were adopted into families to replace relatives lost in war or disease. Others were subjected to harsh treatment, reflecting cycles of revenge and ritual traditions tied to warfare. These practices shocked European observers, though frontier soldiers on both sides sometimes adopted equally brutal methods. Scalping became one of the most notorious aspects of frontier warfare. Although Europeans often associated it exclusively with indigenous peoples, the practice eventually spread among colonial fighters as well. Bounties offered for scalps turned it into a grim measure of battlefield success. Alliances between indigenous nations and European powers played a decisive role in many conflicts. Warriors joined European campaigns for reasons ranging from trade interests to rivalries with neighbouring tribes. These alliances were rarely permanent. Indigenous leaders supported partners only as long as the relationship served their own goals. European commanders gradually learned that success on the frontier required cooperation with indigenous allies. Rangers and scouts familiar with woodland warfare became essential. Mixed forces combining European soldiers and indigenous warriors often proved far more effective than conventional armies operating alone. As colonial populations expanded, however, the balance of power shifted. Even when indigenous forces achieved impressive victories, they struggled to replace losses or secure long-term resources. European settlements continued to grow and were supported by distant governments, capable of supplying men, weapons, and money. By the early 19th century, the combination of population growth, military expansion, and political pressure gradually overcame the resistance of indigenous nations in the eastern half of North America. The death of Tecumseh marked a turning point. Without a unified leadership capable of rallying many tribes, the long era of coordinated resistance came to an end. The centuries of conflict that preceded that moment reveal a different story from the familiar narrative of rapid conquest. Indigenous warriors resisted European expansion for generations. They adapted new weapons, mastered unfamiliar technologies, and forced European armies to rethink the way wars were fought in the forests of North America.